I always enjoyed the thrill of hiking alone in the wild. There's something about the solitude of nature that gets to me in a way nothing else can. The peace, the fresh air, the rhythmic sound of my boots hitting the dirt. It all clears my mind. But on this trip, I felt a little different. Maybe it was because I was hiking a less familiar trail, deep into the mountains of southern Idaho. Or maybe it was the strange feeling I had as I made camp at dusk, the trees whispering with the evening breeze. Either way, something didn't feel quite right. I had been preparing for this trip for weeks. I was 28, and hiking alone had always been my thing. But on this particular evening, as I set up my tent near a small creek, I had this nagging feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I dismissed it as just nerves, but it stayed with me. It wasn't long before the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting the forest in shadows. I pulled my jacket tighter, the air beginning to chill, and I sat by my campfire. The flames crackled and popped, the smoke swirling up into the night sky. I had a small pot of coffee brewing over the fire, my only company the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant calls of night animals. I hadn't seen any other hikers all day. The trail was quiet, which made it even more peaceful but also eerie. There were stories about this part of the mountains, stories about the predators that lived here, stories I had heard but never took too seriously. It was easy to brush off warnings like those, especially when you're young and full of confidence. As the night deepened, I settled into the silence. I knew I'd need to get some sleep soon, but something caught my attention. A movement, or maybe it was the lack of movement. I froze, eyes darting to the edges of the fire's light. My heartbeat quickened, but I told myself it was just a deer or a small animal. I grabbed my flashlight from my backpack and shined it into the trees around me. Nothing, but the unease wouldn't leave me. I had always been good at reading the signs of nature, the way animals move, the sounds they make. And in the silence, there was something off. The forest was too quiet. Even the usual night critters had fallen silent. I felt a chill that wasn't from the temperature alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my instinct told me to get to my feet, keep moving. Maybe it was the feeling of being watched, the deep instinct that told me something was near. I started to scan the area around me more carefully, scanning the shadows in the trees, trying to pinpoint any movement. But nothing. I slowly sat back down, forcing my breath to calm, but the restlessness wouldn't fade. That's when I heard it. A twig snapping from behind me. I whipped around, the beam of my flashlight swinging wildly. My heart pounded in my chest. The beam caught nothing but trees. For a moment, I considered calling out, but I quickly pushed that thought aside. What if it was just an animal? I didn't want to make a sound and draw attention. I sat there for a while, my nerves frayed, the fire popping as the wood burned low. The feeling of being watched didn't go away, and I knew I wasn't imagining it. I had camped in the wilderness enough times to recognize the signs of predators. And while I'd heard the stories about mountain lions, I had never actually come across one. But tonight felt different. The night grew darker, colder, and I decided it was time to turn in. I made sure everything around my camp was secure, including my food, which I'd stored high in the trees. Mountain lions were known to scavenge, and I didn't want to take any chances. I got into my tent and zipped it up, trying to shake off the feeling that something was out there. But sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing rustling, the occasional snap of a twig. Could have been anything. Still, I felt the tension in my muscles, a deep awareness that something wasn't right. I lay there, eyes wide open, listening. The fire outside had burned down to embers, and the forest seemed to close in around me. I started to drift, but that feeling of being watched kept me alert. Suddenly, I heard it again. Another twig snap, but this time closer, much closer. I sat up, grabbing my flashlight. My heart raced as the beam danced across the trees. Nothing. It was impossible to tell if the sound was from a creature or just the forest settling, but my gut told me it was no small animal. That's when I remembered the advice I had read. Always be aware of your surroundings in mountain lion country. They were solitary creatures, usually shy, but if they were hungry or desperate, they might not hesitate. I checked my surroundings again. The moon had come out, casting an eerie glow over the woods. I could barely make out the outline of the trees beyond the weak light of my fire. My mind raced through every possible scenario, and a terrifying thought crept into my mind. What if a mountain lion was stalking me? I wasn't sure how long I lay there in the silence, but eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. The rustling and snapping of branches kept coming closer. I grabbed my jacket and stepped out of the tent, holding my flashlight up high, trying to seem larger. I knew that mountain lions could be unpredictable, and showing fear could make me a target. Getting big, making noise, that was the way to scare it off. I called out, "Hey, go away." My voice was shaky but loud. I waved my arms above my head, trying to make myself seem as big as possible. The sound of my voice carried through the trees, but nothing responded. I stood there for a long time, waiting, listening. The silence was deafening, but I wasn't sure whether that was a good thing or a bad one. Then I heard it again, closer than ever. A low growl. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just a sound, it was a warning. I knew that growl. I had heard it once before when a ranger had taught me about the behavior of big cats. The growl wasn't aggressive, but it was a signal of proximity. I wasn't alone. I started to back away slowly, keeping the beam of my flashlight on the ground and the trees. I knew that mountain lions usually avoided confrontation, but if it was desperate enough, it could still be a threat. My mind raced through the advice I had read. Make myself look bigger, act aggressive. But I wasn't sure if it would even work. The last thing I wanted was to make the wrong move. I heard a rustle in the bushes behind me. A stick snapped. I froze. The growl came again, louder this time and closer. I felt my stomach drop. I turned quickly, my flashlight now scanning the area in every direction. I was sure I saw something move, but it was too quick to catch. My heart thudded in my chest as I started to back up toward my tent. It was then that I heard the most terrifying thing of all. The sound of paws padding on the ground, light but steady. The mountain lion was following me. It was real. It was out there, and I wasn't sure what to do next. I kept moving carefully, keeping my eyes on the surrounding trees. I had read that the best thing to do was to make noise, make myself as threatening as possible. I wasn't sure if I was ready for this, but I had no choice. With a deep breath, I shouted again, waving my arms even higher. "Go away!" I screamed, hoping my voice was louder than the pounding of my heart. But then it stopped. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing. No growl, no movement, no sign of the creature. I stood there, frozen, every muscle tense, waiting. The silence stretched on for minutes, and I couldn't help but think about what would happen next. Would it attack? Was I just lucky to have scared it off? Finally, I let out a breath I didn't know I had been holding. The rustling stopped. The growling stopped. Everything stopped. I slowly turned and made my way back to the tent, keeping my senses sharp. I didn't dare take my eyes off the surrounding darkness. As I climbed back into my tent, I made sure everything was secured and zipped tight. I lay there, staring at the fabric above me, the adrenaline slowly leaving my body. I never saw the mountain lion, but I knew it had been there, close, watching me. The encounter wasn't aggressive, but the fear it caused was real. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening to every little sound, knowing that the wilderness is full of dangers. Some you can predict, and others, like tonight, you just can't. By morning, everything was quiet. The forest had returned to its usual rhythm, and I packed up my things, ready to leave. As I made my way down the trail, I couldn't shake the memory of the growl, of those eyes in the darkness. But I also knew one thing: I had survived, and I would never forget the lesson learned that night in the wild. Respect the wilderness. It's not just beautiful, it's dangerous. The story started back in 1997, when I was 12 years old, fresh off the bus to Pine Valley Summer Camp, tucked deep into the heart of the Oregon woods. Pine trees stretched for miles, dark and silent, and if you listened closely, you could hear the wind whispering through their branches, almost like the woods themselves were speaking. I remember that first night, sitting around the campfire with the other kids, the fire crackling in the cool evening air. Our camp counselor, a man named Rick, had gathered us around for the usual campfire stories. Rick wasn't like the other counselors I had met in past years. He was older, probably in his late 30s, with a deep voice and a kind of quiet intensity that kept everyone on edge. He always wore gloves, even when it was warm, and he never took them off, not even when he was cooking or eating. That night, as the firelight danced on the group's faces, Rick leaned in, his eyes dark, his voice low. "Now, I know you've heard your fair share of ghost stories," he began, his gaze sweeping over all of us. "But tonight, I'm going to tell you something different. This is about a real killer, not some ghost or ghoul." We all leaned forward, eager to hear what he had to say. He continued, talking about the first body found in the woods not far from here in the spring of 1987. It was a man, a large guy who had gone missing while camping with a friend. A couple of weeks later, his body was discovered, lying near a trail. The thing that struck the authorities as odd wasn't just his death. It was what was missing. His left hand, Rick said, his voice growing even quieter. The pointer finger, ring finger, and pinky were gone. Clean off. Not a trace left behind. We all exchanged uneasy glances. A strange chill ran through me as Rick paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the group, as though he could sense we were all already a bit unsettled. "At first, the police thought it was just some freak accident," he went on. "Maybe he got caught in something, a wild animal, maybe, but the truth is they never found any clues. No blood, no sign of a struggle, just a body with 3 fingers missing." I remember glancing at the others around the fire, all of us trying to process what Rick had just said. I'd heard about body parts being removed in other kinds of stories, but it felt real, too real. Rick took a deep breath and looked into the fire. 2 weeks later, another body turned up. Same deal. Another man, smaller than the first, but the same fingers missing from his left hand. Again, no clues, no witnesses, just a body. I could see the firelight flicker in Rick's eyes as he continued, his voice soft but carrying an unsettling weight. And it didn't stop there. Over the next several months, the bodies kept turning up. A few men, then a couple of women, and finally kids. As the bodies got smaller, the pieces of the puzzle started to fit together in ways no one expected. I shivered, though I wasn't sure if it was from the chill of the night or from Rick's story. He had us all hooked, completely transfixed by his words. Every victim had their left fingers cut off, pointer, ring, and pinky. But then came the teenagers, and that's when things started to get really weird. I remember the way Rick's eyes seemed to sharpen, his gaze turning to each of us in turn. "The last victim was a teenage boy," he said slowly, his voice low and dangerous. "He was found deep in the woods, and this time something was different. The killer had taken only 2 fingers, his ring finger and pinky, just like all the others. But this time, the police found something. A fingerprint." Rick paused, letting the suspense hang in the air before he continued. The fingerprint matched someone who had been arrested years before. A thief, a man who had been caught stealing from a nearby town. His prints were on file. The silence around the campfire grew heavy. I could hear the others breathing, waiting for Rick to continue. "And here's where it gets really dark," Rick said, taking a deep breath. "The police didn't know who the killer was, but there was something strange about this fingerprint." Rick didn't immediately say more, but the tension was palpable, thick enough that you could almost cut it with a knife. His gaze never left us, and I felt my heart begin to pound in my chest. That fingerprint belonged to a man named Thomas Markson. He worked a construction job nearby, and he'd lost part of his left hand in a work accident. They say it was a terrible accident. He lost his pointer finger, his ring finger, and his pinky. Doctors did what they could, but his hand was never the same. He could still work, still use tools, but it wasn't easy for him. At this point, I was on edge, not sure whether to believe what I was hearing. Could Rick be telling the truth, or was he just spinning a campfire tale? But the look in his eyes told me this wasn't some made-up story. It was personal for him. Something had happened, something that made him carry the weight of this story for years. "I know what you're thinking," Rick said, his voice going lower, as though he were reading our minds. "You're wondering how it connects, right? How does a man like that, someone with half a hand, become a killer, someone who'd go after the fingers of other people?" He leaned in close to the fire, and for the first time, he slowly pulled off his left glove, revealing his hand. His fingers were scarred, but more than that, half of his ring and pinky fingers were missing. It was the same hand he had told us about, the one he had been hiding from us all this time. The air around the fire grew cold, and no one spoke. We all just stared at his hand, the missing fingers, the scars that marred the skin. Rick stood up suddenly, his eyes wild. You see, the killer wasn't just trying to take fingers. He was looking for the right ones, the right fit, and he wouldn't stop until he found them. He thought the missing fingers would make him whole again. A few kids let out nervous laughs, trying to break the tension, but Rick's expression was deadly serious. He took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "Do you get it now?" he whispered, his voice sharp. He wanted to replace what he lost, and he wasn't going to stop. Not until he got every finger, every single one. Even if it meant killing people, even kids, because he thought their fingers would fit better. With that, Rick lunged forward, and I remember the scream that tore from my throat. I jumped backward, heart racing, as Rick laughed and pulled back, his expression now softer. He had been playing us all along, but for that split second, I thought we were all doomed. He quickly apologized, but I could still hear my heart pounding in my ears. Later that night, Rick told us the truth. "I didn't kill anyone," he explained, his voice much calmer now. "But I did lose these fingers in a work accident. It was a dangerous job and I made a mistake. Doctors tried their best, but they couldn't save everything. I've been hiding my hand for years, and I tell this story every year because it's a reminder of what can happen when you're careless." We all sat quietly, digesting everything Rick had said. And that night, as I lay in my tent, trying to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there. A killer who wanted something I couldn't quite understand. And it wasn't just about revenge. It was about something deeper, something darker. The next morning, the sun rose over the trees, and the camp resumed its normal activities. But I couldn't forget Rick's story. And over the years, I would hear whispers about Thomas Markson, the man who had lost his fingers and perhaps lost his mind. But one thing I knew for sure, there was something in the woods, something that could never be explained. I worked as a camp counselor for a few summers at a place called Whispering Pines, a summer camp nestled deep in the woods of northern Idaho. It was the kind of place where the trees stretched for miles, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. During the day, the kids ran wild through the forest trails, played games, and swam in the lake. But when night fell, the atmosphere changed completely. The campfire would crackle, and the shadows from the trees would stretch long across the grounds. And that's when the stories would begin. I was always the one to tell the scariest stories. The kids loved it. There was one in particular that I had honed into my signature ghost story. I'd been telling it for a few summers, and it was a big hit with the kids every time. It was the perfect mix of fear and mystery that they seemed to eat up. I'd start off by setting the scene. There's a ghost that haunts these very woods. I'd tell them, my voice dropping low to make sure they were hanging on every word. He's known as the Collector, and he's been around longer than anyone can remember. He's not a nice ghost, mind you. Not like the ones you hear about in campfire tales who just want to scare you for fun. I'd pause and look around at their wide eyes. It was always fun to watch their expressions, their faces going pale and their bodies leaning forward, anticipating what would come next. This ghost, the Collector, doesn't want to scare you for fun. I'd continue. He wants something from you. He doesn't kill everyone who crosses his path, no. But he has a deal. If you happen to meet him in the woods, you have a choice. You can give him 2 of your teeth and tell him 2 names of people you'd want him to take. If you refuse, or if you can't give him what he wants, he'll come for you himself. There's no escaping him, no running away. You can only bargain with him. I'd lean in closer to the kids, making sure they could feel the tension in the air. The worst part? If you meet him, he doesn't just take any teeth. He takes the ones that hurt the most, the ones that you don't even notice are missing until they're gone. He'll take the teeth you've kept hidden, the ones you thought no one would notice. By now, the kids were usually silent, eyes wide. They were so hooked on the story, their imaginations running wild with the possibilities. The thing is, that story wasn't just fiction to me. There was something about it that I couldn't shake, something that had always bothered me on a deeper level. You see, I had a strange experience with my own teeth when I was younger. As a kid, I'd lost all my baby teeth like everyone else, but 2 of my adult teeth never came in. There were gaps in my mouth for years where they should have been. I remember feeling self-conscious about it when I was a teenager, and I eventually got a retainer with 2 fake teeth to fill in the space. It wasn't a big deal, but it was a constant reminder that something wasn't quite right. I didn't really think much about it at the time. I was busy being a teenager and then a young adult. But when I became a camp counselor, I started using that retainer in my ghost story routine. The night before we would send the kids off to bed, I'd secretly pop out my retainer and give them a big, toothy smile. It was always the same reaction: shock, fear, and sometimes a little scream. The kids would stare at my mouth, wide-eyed, not sure what they'd just seen. I loved it. It was my little secret, and it always scared the kids silly. It was all in good fun, I thought. After all, they knew it was just a trick. Or did they? The summer of 2014 was when things started to feel different. I was 22 at the time, still full of youthful energy and enthusiasm, but something had shifted in me. It had been a long day of activities, and I was exhausted. But the night came, and as usual, I gathered the kids around the campfire for the evening story. I did my usual ghost story routine, but for some reason, that night the words felt heavier. The fire crackled loudly in the background, and the kids sat silently, watching me. I told the story like I always did, and at the end, I made my usual eerie smile and popped out my retainer. I didn't think anything of it until I saw one of the younger kids, a boy named Jamie, staring at me with wide, fearful eyes. He was trembling. At first, I thought it was just because of the story, but his fear was different. His eyes were locked on my teeth, and his face went pale. "What's wrong, Jamie?" I asked, trying to lighten the mood. Jamie didn't answer at first. He just kept staring at me. The other kids were giggling as usual, but Jamie wasn't laughing. He looked like he'd seen something that had chilled him to his core. "Jamie?" I repeated, starting to get concerned. I leaned closer to him, lowering my voice. "It's just a joke, kid. It's nothing to be afraid of." Jamie swallowed hard, but his eyes didn't leave my face. Finally, he whispered, "Those teeth. They look like the ones in the story, the collector's teeth." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I laughed it off, trying to make it sound like a joke, but a seed of doubt had been planted in my mind. I pushed it away and sent the kids off to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I brushed it off as just another overactive imagination from a kid who'd heard too many stories. But the next few nights, the unease grew. Each time I told the story and did my toothy trick, I noticed something strange. The kids weren't just frightened, they were genuinely scared. There was a deeper fear in their eyes, something I hadn't seen before. They'd look at me like I was someone or something different. Even some of the other counselors started to look at me a little funny, like they were unsettled by the way I smiled. I tried to ignore it. After all, I was just a camp counselor. I was there to entertain, not to make people uncomfortable. But the longer I stayed at the camp, the more I started to feel like I wasn't entirely in control of the situation anymore. It was as if the story had taken on a life of its own. One night, after a long day of canoeing and swimming, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned in my cabin, the weight of the events from the past few days pressing down on me. I couldn't stop thinking about Jamie's words. Could it be possible that there was more to the story than I realized? Could it be that something about my missing teeth, the ones that never came in, had somehow made the story too real? That night, I decided to take a walk by myself. The moon was full, and the forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I didn't expect to find anything, but there was a strange pull in my chest, as if the woods were calling to me. I walked along the trail, my mind racing. I reached the spot near the old oak tree where we usually told the ghost story. The tree was gnarled, its branches reaching out like twisted fingers. As I stood there, I could almost hear the whispers of past campers, their stories, their fears. I stared up at the tree, lost in thought, when something made me look down. There, on the ground, was a small object. I bent down to pick it up, and my heart stopped. It was a tooth. My mind went blank. How could a tooth be here? Who would leave a tooth in the woods, and why now, after all these years? I turned it over in my hand. It looked too familiar. It was a baby tooth, one that was missing from my own mouth. I felt my stomach twist. This couldn't be real. There had to be some explanation. But deep down, I knew that there was no reasonable explanation. I stood up slowly, my mind racing. I glanced around the woods, suddenly feeling watched. There was something in the air, something unsettling, but I couldn't place it. I turned and walked quickly back to the camp, the tooth still clutched in my hand. I never told anyone about that night. The next morning, I found my retainer on the floor of my cabin, as if it had been knocked out of place during the night. I never used it again. Something had shifted. It was like the line between the story I told and the reality of the camp had blurred, and I didn't want to tempt fate any longer. I finished out the summer, but I never told that story again. The kids still asked about it, but I just smiled and changed the subject. As for me, I moved on from camp, went to college, and eventually left Whispering Pines behind. But every now and then, when I'm lying awake at night, I think about that tooth, the one I found in the woods, and I can't help but wonder if there's something in that old story that's more than just a tale. Maybe there are things out there, hidden in the shadows, that we're better off not knowing about. I had been driving through Ireland for a couple of days now, trying to make the most of my time. The rain had started light, almost as if the weather had just decided to change. The gray clouds above me seemed endless, and the drizzle turned into a downpour. It wasn't unusual for the weather to turn quickly here, but I wasn't prepared for how fast it had gotten worse. I was driving through a rural part of County Kerry, somewhere off the beaten path, a place I had only read about in travel books. I loved the idea of the Irish countryside, remote, beautiful, but lonely. The narrow, winding roads kept twisting through thick forests, and as the fog settled in thick layers around me, visibility dropped dramatically. My wipers were working overtime, and still I could barely see past the hood of my old hatchback. My mind wandered for a moment, distracted by the thick fog swirling in front of me. But then, a sinking feeling hit me. The road had been narrowing, and the signs had stopped making sense. I checked my GPS again. The map was glitchy, showing me on a smaller, thinner road than I thought. I should have taken a turn back there. How had I missed it? I was off course now, but there wasn't really anywhere to turn around. The road was too narrow, lined by stone walls on both sides and wet trees clinging to the earth like they were about to collapse under the weight of the rain. As I pressed on, I kept telling myself that I would find somewhere to stop, but the storm didn't seem to be letting up. It was as though the road was swallowing me. I could hardly make out anything in the distance. All I could do was keep going and hope it would get better. I wasn't exactly a seasoned traveler, but I had done my research. Ireland was supposed to be quaint, charming, and filled with warm-hearted people, right? Well, there wasn't a soul in sight, not even a glimpse of a house or a barn. It was just endless road, wet trees, and a storm that wouldn't stop. Then, without warning, the car started to stutter. I felt the engine sputter and choke. My heart dropped. I thought I'd stalled. I pressed on the accelerator, but the engine just refused to respond. I checked my gauges, no battery warning, no oil light. Everything seemed fine, but the engine had completely died. I rolled to a stop on the side of the road, and the rain pounded on my car like 100 hammers. It took a moment before I realized the car wasn't just turned off. There was no life left in it at all. Frustration coursed through me, and I cursed the weather, my bad luck, and my own poor judgment. I grabbed my jacket, zipping it up as tightly as I could, and shoved the keys into my pocket. The first thing that came to mind was just walking to the nearest town, wherever it was. There had to be something ahead. Maybe I could catch a lift from someone, or at least find a phone to call for help. I slammed the door behind me, bracing against the gusts of wind that hit me as soon as I stepped out. The rain was unrelenting, soaking me through in seconds. My shoes slipped on the wet ground, and my visibility was so poor that I could barely see a few feet ahead. I kept walking, hoping to find some sign of civilization. The road stretched ahead, no end in sight, and no cars passed by to offer any relief. I had walked for what felt like an eternity, my legs aching, and my clothes clinging to me in the cold. It wasn't until an hour later that I heard something distant but unmistakable, the sound of an engine. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned my head instinctively, hoping for a glimpse of a passing car. My eyes searched desperately through the rain and fog, but the headlights were faint, barely cutting through the wall of water that had settled over everything. As the car came closer, I could barely make out the dim outline of it. My body was shaking now, not just from the cold, but from the growing unease in my gut. The car crept closer at a pace that made no sense, as if the driver wasn't in any rush to get anywhere. And that was when I froze. The headlights flickered, and the car pulled up beside me. It was an old sedan, nothing remarkable about it except that it seemed almost out of place here, on a road like this at this hour. The vehicle didn't stop moving, it slowed, barely moving at all, but it was still moving. In a split second of panic, I acted. I reached out and grabbed the back door, pulling it open as if I had no choice. I didn't hesitate, I jumped in. As the door slammed shut behind me, the car continued forward without any change in its movement. I took a quick glance around, and a jolt of terror shot through me. There was no driver. There was no one in the front seat at all. I had no idea what to do. My breath caught in my throat as the realization hit. I was sitting in a car with no one at the wheel, and it was moving. I could feel the vibrations of the engine as the vehicle continued forward. The car was driving itself, or at least it seemed like it. I couldn't make sense of it, but there was no time to figure out why. The car didn't stop, didn't swerve. It just kept crawling through the rain. I sat there frozen, staring at the road, terrified of what might be next. The rain was blurring everything, but after some time, I saw it. A village, dimly lit in the distance. It wasn't much, but it was something. The car continued its slow crawl toward it. I had to get out, this wasn't normal. I couldn't stay in that car, not like this. When the car finally reached the village, it slowed even more. The street lights flickered in the mist, casting shadows that seemed to stretch forever. The car rolled past several dark houses and then, slowly, stopped in front of what looked like a pub. It was the only place that seemed alive, warm, and welcoming in the middle of this desolate place. I could almost feel the heat through the window. Without thinking, I yanked the door open and ran. I didn't look back. I just ran. Inside, I was drenched, soaked to the bone, my clothes clinging to my skin, my hair plastered to my forehead. The warmth inside hit me like a physical force, and I collapsed onto one of the stools, panting heavily. I ordered a beer with shaky hands and tried to steady myself. My heart was still pounding, my mind racing, trying to understand what had just happened. But before I could even take a sip, the door opened and two men walked in. They were just as soaked as I was, dripping water onto the floor as they entered. They had that rough, local look to them, weathered faces and eyes that had seen their share of storms. They glanced around, their gaze briefly falling on me, and then one of them pointed directly at me. "That's him, Patty?" the taller man said, voice low and almost too casual. "That's the bastard I saw jump out of the car we were pushing." My stomach twisted in knots. Couldn't breathe. I hadn't seen anyone. I hadn't heard anyone. How could they possibly know? The car hadn't been moving when I jumped out. I'd barely been inside for a minute, but they knew. They were talking about the car, the one I had just fled from. And that's when the truth hit me. It hadn't been a self-driving car. It had been abandoned, left there by whoever had been pushing it earlier. They must have been trying to get it started, and when I jumped out, I had unwittingly walked into a nightmare. I stood up, my legs unsteady, my mind struggling to process what I had just heard. But as I looked at their faces, I realized I wasn't going to get any answers here. Not tonight, not ever. Without another word, I grabbed my coat and walked out, the cold air slapping me in the face as I stepped back onto the rain-soaked street. I didn't look back. I've lived in a small town tucked away in the heart of the mountains for as long as I can remember. It's the kind of place where you know everyone, and the nearest neighbor is miles away. My name is Ryan, and growing up surrounded by wilderness meant that I spent most of my weekends in the woods, hunting, fishing, or just exploring. Camping, for me and my friends, was a regular part of life. We did it year-round, even when the winter chill made the mountains feel like a whole different world. That summer, I was 17. A group of us decided to get together for another weekend of camping. Familiar territory for all of us. It was the kind of thing we did every chance we got. There were 6 of us in total, all ranging from 16 to 19 years old. It was me, my buddy Travis, and a couple of guys from the school, Ryan, Alex, and Jake. The girls in our group, Sarah and Emily, were close friends of mine, but for this trip, they opted to stay back with the rest of the group. We picked a spot near a small stream that cut through the woods. The area was known for its good fishing, and we all agreed that if we wanted to catch anything worth bragging about, that was the place to go. It wasn't far from the main campsite, just about a mile away, but it felt much more remote, tucked into the trees. That was part of the draw, seclusion. We didn't want to pack too much gear. It was going to be a 2-night trip, so we only brought one tent for all of us. But we didn't mind that much because we knew we could improvise. Travis, being the more outdoorsy of the two of us, suggested we make a lean-to out of tarps and sticks and use a large boulder to protect ourselves from the wind. It worked for the most part. The first night, everything felt pretty normal. We set up the fire, got the rods in the water, and cracked open a few beers as the sun dipped below the mountain peaks. The light faded quickly, and before long, we were left with only the crackling of the fire and the soft sounds of the wilderness around us. I remember that night well, the kind of night where you know everything's peaceful, and you can almost feel the land sleeping around you. But I couldn't sleep. I'm not sure what it was, but I felt something off. It's hard to explain. At first, I thought it was just the usual feeling you get when you're in unfamiliar territory, or maybe I had been thinking too much about the possibility of a mountain lion lurking nearby. But the more I sat there, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows on the ground, and the silence felt unnatural. I told myself to relax. We were surrounded by trees, and the mountains were familiar. If there were mountain lions around, I knew how to handle them. They were more scared of us than we were of them. I'd been stalked by them before on hikes, just a few glances and quick movements to remind them we were not prey. But still, there was something about the stillness that didn't sit right with me. I tossed a few more logs onto the fire, hoping the crackling would reassure me. The flames roared for a moment, then settled back into a steady burn. The light from the fire danced across the clearing, giving everything a strange, wavering glow. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was a trick of the firelight, but when I focused, I could make out the figure of a man standing at the edge of the clearing. He was about 80 yards away, just beyond the reach of the firelight, partially obscured by the trees. His posture was stiff, unmoving. I couldn't see much detail, just the dark outline of a person, his shape distinct against the backdrop of the night. The moon was full, casting a cold light over everything, and I could make out the slight glint of his eyes, though they didn't reflect like an animal's would. I don't know how long I stared at him. Felt like an eternity. My heart started racing, but I couldn't move, couldn't look away. My mind was screaming at me to do something, anything, but I was frozen. Every logical thought I had flew out of my head. What was this guy doing out here in the middle of nowhere, standing so still? It didn't make sense. We hadn't seen anyone else all day, and no one else knew we were out here. I didn't call out to him. I didn't wave or try to approach. In that moment, I was paralyzed with fear, unsure of what to do. I wasn't used to this feeling of helplessness, of not knowing what was happening. I was 17, inexperienced, and alone in the woods with only Travis by my side, who, like me, was too stunned to speak. The man didn't move at first. He just stood there, staring at me, or at least I assumed he was. The distance between us was enough that I couldn't be sure. For all I knew, he could have been staring at something else entirely. But the longer I looked at him, the more I felt this sense of wrongness, like he wasn't supposed to be there. After what felt like forever, he turned and walked off into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. His steps were deliberate but quiet, like he knew the land as well as we did. He didn't run. He didn't make a sound. It was as if he had just been part of the forest itself. The fire crackled loudly in the sudden silence. I still didn't move. I didn't even breathe for a moment. All I could do was sit there, still staring into the darkness where the man had been. I had no idea who he was or why he was there, but my instincts told me he wasn't some lost hiker or a fellow camper. It wasn't just the feeling of him watching us that bothered me. It was the fact that he'd just appeared without warning and then vanished without a sound. Travis had finally broken the silence by whispering my name. I don't know how long he had been awake, but when I looked at him, his eyes were wide with fear. He had the same look on his face that I knew I must have had. A mixture of confusion, disbelief, and a little bit of panic. We sat there in the dark for what felt like hours, neither of us saying anything. I didn't sleep a wink that night, not with that feeling still hanging over me. I kept a tight grip on the revolver we had with us, the one we brought along just in case. It wasn't that I thought the man meant harm, but after what had just happened, I wasn't taking any chances. We kept the fire burning hot, the flames licking the air, but it felt like no amount of light would ever chase away the unease that had settled over me. The next morning, we packed up quickly and headed back to the main campsite. We didn't say much to the others. I'm sure they noticed our tense faces, but none of us talked about it. Even now, I still don't talk much about what happened that night. In hindsight, I wish I'd called out to the man, tried to figure out who he was. But in the moment, I had no idea what I was dealing with. I don't know who the man was, but I've thought about him a lot since then. Part of me wonders if he was just some random guy who had wandered off the trail, lost or looking for something. Maybe he was harmless, just someone enjoying the solitude of the mountains like we were. But another part of me, the part that knows how easy it is to get lost in these woods, wonders if he had been watching us for longer than I realized. Either way, I never went back to that spot. I've had enough close calls with animals, and after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else had been watching us. Something human. I've been out in those mountains countless times since, but I've never forgotten that night, that figure standing at the edge of the firelight, and the chill that ran through me as he disappeared into the trees. I've learned a lot since then about nature, about safety, and about myself. But I'll never forget the terror of that night and the man who might have just been passing through, or might have been something else entirely. It was late summer, and I'd been planning this hike for months. My girlfriend, Kayla, and I had always loved getting out into the wild, leaving the noise of everyday life behind. This time, we decided on an overnight trip along the North Country Trail, a rugged stretch of wilderness that we'd been eyeing for a while. The day started off beautifully. The weather was perfect, just enough warmth to make the hike comfortable, but cool enough to avoid the sweltering heat. Kayla and I made good time through the trail, stopping to take a break here and there, enjoying the silence and the occasional chirp of birds and rustle of leaves. The forest was thick with trees, and we had the whole place to ourselves. Felt like the world was on pause. We had a good rhythm going, our boots crunching along the dirt trail as we steadily made our way deeper into the woods. We hadn't planned on pushing ourselves too hard that day, but as the sun began to dip below the horizon, we found a spot that seemed perfect for setting up camp. The trail had thinned out, and we could hear the distant hum of a stream. It wasn't too far off the trail, maybe 30 feet, just enough to feel like we were in our own little pocket of wilderness. Kayla and I set up our hammocks in tandem, each of us carefully arranging our gear. It felt like second nature by now, knowing exactly what needed to be done. We'd been on enough trips that packing up, setting up, and everything in between had become a routine. Kayla went ahead and gathered some dry wood for a fire, and I hung our food in a tree nearby to avoid attracting any unwanted guests. The smell of fresh earth and pines was comforting, and for a moment, everything felt right. As darkness crept in, we settled into our hammocks, letting the quiet of the forest wrap around us. I pulled my jacket tighter, feeling the cool breeze against my skin, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees above. We weren't far from the trail, but in the vastness of the woods, it felt like we were alone, isolated from the rest of the world. The night was serene for the most part. We had been lying there for about an hour, eyes closed, just listening to the sounds of nature. But then, a noise caught my attention. It was soft at first, like a small crunch of leaves, but it was distinct enough to make me stir in my hammock. I lifted my head slightly, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. There, in the shadows, about 10 feet away, I saw a shape. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on my eyes. But as I focused, the shape became clearer. It was a coyote, standing still in the dark, its eyes reflecting the little light there was. We locked eyes for a moment, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was staring right at me, sizing me up, as if weighing whether or not to make a move. I didn't want to startle it. Kayla was still asleep, unaware of the sudden shift in atmosphere. I stayed as still as I could, my breath slow and shallow, trying not to draw attention. The coyote didn't make a sound, just stood there, unmoving, its gaze unwavering. And then, without warning, it turned and bolted into the woods, its paws silent on the forest floor. Before I could even process what had just happened, another noise came from the opposite direction. This one was different, a heavier sound, more like something larger. I couldn't see what it was, but the rustling was unmistakable, accompanied by the sound of branches snapping. Whatever it was, it had been watching us as well. I gently nudged Kayla, waking her up. She stirred but didn't fully open her eyes. I whispered, "I think we should pack up." Her voice was groggy, but she trusted my instincts. She didn't question me, and we quickly got to work, packing our things. The quiet of the night was now replaced with the subtle tension of not knowing what else was out there. The earlier calm was gone, replaced by a lingering unease. Once we had everything packed up, we decided to keep moving. The light from our headlamps cut through the night as we made our way down the trail, our footsteps quick but careful. The air felt heavier now, more oppressive. Even though I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, we pressed on. I kept a steady pace, always scanning the darkness around us, feeling the weight of every branch and bush that moved in the wind. We walked for what felt like hours, the trail winding through thick forest, before something caught our attention. There, ahead of us, just off the trail, was a small figure darting into the brush. I froze for a moment, squinting to see what it was. My stomach dropped when I realized what I was looking at: a black bear cub. It must have been startled by the light of our headlamps, and it took off quickly, vanishing into the thick underbrush. My first instinct was to move away, to get back on the trail as fast as possible. I had learned enough to know that where there's a cub, there's usually a mother not far behind. Kayla and I didn't say much after that, our silence heavy with the awareness that we had crossed paths with something far more dangerous than we'd initially expected. We didn't stop to rest after that. We just kept moving, putting distance between ourselves and whatever else might be lurking out there. The trail felt endless, the night stretching out around us. We were both on edge, the adrenaline keeping us alert. Every rustle in the bushes made us jump. Every snap of a twig felt like the approach of something larger, something more dangerous. Eventually, after what felt like hours of walking, we came to a small clearing. We decided to stop and catch our breath. The stars above seemed distant, almost unreachable, and the silence of the forest was overwhelming. It was a relief to finally sit down, to just breathe, even though our minds were still racing. I had expected to feel more at ease now that we were away from the immediate danger, but the forest had a way of making everything feel strange. The shadows were deeper now, and the sounds of the woods had taken on a different tone. There were no more birds, no more rustling of small animals, just the whisper of the wind through the trees. We sat there for a while, not speaking, just listening to the stillness. The forest had returned to its natural rhythm, but the uneasy feeling hadn't gone away. It lingered in the back of my mind, that constant sense of being watched, of not being alone. It wasn't a feeling I could shake, no matter how hard I tried. Finally, we decided to keep moving again, knowing that there was still a long way to go before we'd be back at the trailhead. We both agreed that we'd finish the hike and get back to the car as quickly as we could. The calm of the day was long gone, replaced by an ever-present awareness that the wilderness could be both beautiful and unforgiving. By the time we made it back to the parking lot, the first light of dawn was starting to creep over the horizon. The sun was low, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples. We were exhausted, our bodies sore from the hike, but there was a strange sense of relief in knowing that we had made it through the night without any further incidents. As we loaded our gear into the car, I took one last look at the trail. The forest was quiet now, but I couldn't help but feel that it held secrets, things we weren't meant to see. The events of the night, the coyote, the bear cub, the sense of something watching us, were enough to remind me that the wilderness is not always as peaceful as it seems. It's a place where nature rules, and even the slightest misstep can lead to danger. We drove off, the road ahead seeming less daunting than the dark woods we had just left behind. As I glanced at Kayla, I could see that she was just as shaken as I was, but we didn't need to say anything. We both understood that sometimes, it's the things we can't see that make the wild truly terrifying. It was the summer of 2021 when my husband, Ben, and I decided to take a trip out to the remote corners of Wyoming. We had been planning it for months. A quiet, secluded getaway to get away from the noise of everyday life. The Boysen Reservoir had always sounded like the perfect spot for a camping trip, beautiful and quiet, with stunning views of the water stretching out under the sky. We were lucky enough to snag a beachfront campsite, which we were told was a rare find. It was directly on the water, a site that led straight to the beach with nothing but open space around it. The downside? It was far away from any other campers. It sounded like a dream. There were no neighbors, no loud families, no people to bother us. Just the two of us, nature, and the open air. When we arrived, the sun was high in the sky, the warm, dry air of Wyoming embracing us as we pulled our truck into the campsite. The drive had been long and the roads had been rugged, but it had been worth it. Our campsite was tucked away from the main area, nestled against the shoreline of the reservoir. The water was calm, the sand almost untouched, just the way we had imagined. We set up our tent with ease, unloading our gear from the truck, and gathered the kindling to start a fire. The landscape was sprawling, the kind of openness you only get in Wyoming, where you could see for miles without anything obstructing your view. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, we settled in around the fire, the only sound being the crackling of the wood and the soft rustling of the wind in the trees. But as night descended, the eeriness of the place started to sink in. The silence was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just quiet, it was dead silent. There were no distant murmurs of traffic, no soft sounds of animals in the trees, nothing. It was as if the entire world had gone mute. Even the usual nighttime sounds you might hear in the wilderness, owls, crickets, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, were absent. The only noise was the fire, and even that felt out of place. At first, it didn't bother us. We sat by the fire, sipping our drinks, talking about everything and nothing. But as the darkness deepened, I began to feel off. Something about the vast emptiness of the place started to weigh on me. Maybe it was the distance between us and the other campsites. We hadn't seen a single soul since we arrived. It was just us and the quiet. That's when we heard the sound of an engine in the distance. It was a low, rumbling noise, and it seemed to come from nowhere. The road to our site wasn't a proper highway. It was more of a dirt path that led out into the wilderness, winding through the trees before it reached the beach. It was the kind of place where you would expect no one to be, where people would rarely drive down unless they had a good reason. But there it was, a black SUV, its headlights cutting through the dark like a shadow. The vehicle slowed as it approached our campsite, then turned down the small dirt road that led to the beach. Ben, who had been watching the fire, glanced up and waved in case they were lost or needed help. It wasn't a big deal, just another car, right? But they didn't wave back. They didn't even slow down or acknowledge us. They just drove straight past our campsite, continuing toward the beach, their headlights momentarily illuminating the water surface before they turned around and headed back the way they came. They weren't lost. They didn't need help. I watched them closely. The car was completely blacked out, and I couldn't make out anything about the driver. It was a strange feeling, like they were watching us, but we were the ones being observed. I shook off the feeling at first. It was probably nothing. But then, a thought crossed my mind. Why would they drive down to the beach if they weren't looking for something? Or someone? Ben looked at me, his brow furrowed. "That was weird," he said, more to himself than to me. "I didn't like the way they ignored us." I agreed. Something about it didn't sit right, but we didn't have any reason to worry. At least not yet. We continued with our evening, trying to push away the uneasy feeling that had crept in. But I couldn't shake the thought that something was off. And then, just as I began to relax again, we saw the SUV's headlights appear again, this time heading straight back into our campsite. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. They weren't just driving by. They were coming back. Ben's hand immediately went to his flashlight, shining it towards the beach where they had been earlier. He scanned the area, trying to see if anyone was there, hidden in the shadows. But it was too dark to make out anything. "Get everything in the car," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Now." His tone left no room for argument. I didn't need to ask why. I could feel it too. The strange, sinking feeling in my gut that told me something was wrong. Something wasn't right. The SUV had come back, and this time, it didn't seem like they were just passing through. I grabbed our bags, tossing everything into the car as quickly as I could. Ben kept the flashlight pointed toward the beach, his eyes darting from the water to the road, as if expecting someone or something to emerge from the darkness. Just as we were finishing up, I heard the sound of the engine again, this time much closer. The SUV was coming back, and they weren't stopping. "Get in the car," Ben snapped. "We're leaving." We jumped into the truck without hesitation. Ben slammed the door shut, his foot already on the gas as we sped out of the campsite. My heart was pounding in my chest as the truck jolted over the uneven, bumpy road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Behind us, the SUV was on our tail. The road was treacherous, twisting and turning through the rugged wilderness. Ben pushed the truck harder, the tires grinding over the dirt and gravel as we sped down the narrow path. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the headlights of the SUV growing larger, the vehicle gaining on us. "Ben, they're still following us," I gasped, panic rising in my voice. "I know," he said through gritted teeth. "I'm not stopping." We flew around bends and over hills, the truck shaking with each bump. The canyon ahead of us was the only chance we had. If we could get through there, maybe, just maybe, we could lose them. The canyon walls loomed ahead, jagged and imposing, casting long shadows across the road. Ben didn't slow down as we entered the narrow pass. The SUV was still right behind us, its headlights flickering in and out of view as we plunged deeper into the canyon's winding path. It was like a chase scene from a movie, but this wasn't some scripted film. This was real. My mind raced. What would they do if they caught us? What were they even after? And why did they follow us for so long? The truck bounced over rocks and uneven ground, the tires screeching as we tried to maintain speed. I could hear the engine of the SUV right behind us, like a constant, oppressive presence. We had to make it through the canyon. We had to. As we rounded the final bend, I looked back once more. The SUV was no longer in sight. The canyon had swallowed the road behind us, and for the first time since the chase began, I felt a sense of relief. We had lost them. Ben didn't let up until we reached the main highway, where the roads were smoother and the signs of civilization were closer. Only then did he slow down, letting out a deep breath. We didn't stop until we were miles away from Boysen Reservoir. We found a gas station in a small town and pulled over to collect our thoughts. The whole drive had been a blur, my mind still processing everything that had just happened. That night, we slept with one eye open, both of us wondering what could have happened if we hadn't trusted our instincts. We never found out who the people in the SUV were or what they wanted, but I'm not sure I ever want to. Looking back, we realize how lucky we were to have left when we did. That trip was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, but instead, it turned into a reminder that sometimes the wilderness holds more than just nature. It holds danger too, and we were lucky enough to escape it. It's been a few years now, but I still remember the exact feeling, the knot in my stomach, the quickening of my pulse. It wasn't the kind of thing you can explain easily, but if I could sum it up, I'd say it was the eerie, unsettling sensation of knowing something's out there watching. You can't see it, but you can feel it. The weight of eyes on the back of your neck, the hairs on your arms standing up without explanation. This particular night, it was as if I was being followed, like the forest itself was alive, and I was the prey. I don't know if I ever really shook the fear, but I remember this one time, out in the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was late October, just before the first snow would hit. My friends and I decided to take a 3-day camping trip deep into the wilderness. We weren't the kind to stick to the popular trails. No, we liked to hike off the beaten path as far as we could go. We arrived at the trailhead around noon, our backpacks loaded with supplies for the next few days. Water, food, sleeping bags, and the usual gear for safety. We didn't expect much trouble. We weren't exactly rookies, but there was something different about this trip. We were used to being in the woods, to the quiet, to the isolation. But this time, the quiet was oppressive. It was like the world was holding its breath. We hiked for hours, the sun beginning to dip lower in the sky as we made our way toward the campsite we'd picked out on the map. A small clearing near a stream, far enough off the main trail that it would be just us. We thought we'd be okay. We thought we could just set up camp and enjoy the serenity of the mountains. But by the time we were about a mile from the clearing, it was getting dark. I hadn't planned on that. It's never a good idea to be caught out in the wilderness when night falls, but we were stubborn. It was close enough to the campsite that we could make it without any real trouble. At least that's what I told myself. I figured we'd be fine. We always made it fine. That's when it hit me, the silence. I remember that feeling well. It's that hollow, stomach-sinking sensation when you realize you've stepped into a place where the world has gone still unnaturally so. It's different than the usual calm of the forest at night. This wasn't the peace of nature. This was wrong. I paused. My friends, a couple of guys, were still ahead of me, walking steadily toward the campsite, unaware of the growing unease gnawing at me. I slowed my pace and did a quick sweep with my flashlight, scanning the area. It was pitch black now, save for the small beam of light cutting through the trees. At first, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Just trees, shadows stretching long on the ground, the occasional rustle of branches swaying in the breeze. But then, my light hit something, a reflection, 2 glowing yellow eyes, staring back at me. I froze. I felt my heart skip a beat, a jolt of adrenaline shooting through me. The reflection didn't move. It just stayed there, locked on me. I quickly turned the light away, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer. But as I swung the beam back, the eyes were still there. I swallowed hard, feeling my breath catch in my throat. Mountain lion. The thought slammed into my brain like a freight train. There was no doubt in my mind. Those eyes were too big, too wide for anything else. A deer's eyes wouldn't glow like that. They wouldn't be that focused. I immediately stopped moving and listened. The wind had died down. I could hear nothing but the faint rustle of leaves in the distance. I looked back at my friends, who were still walking ahead, blissfully unaware. They'd never hear me if I called out, and I didn't want to startle whatever was out there. If it was a mountain lion, I knew better than to provoke it. I stepped back slowly, my breath shallow. My fingers tightened around the flashlight as I tried to stay calm. I checked my pack to make sure my pistol was still there, always carried it for moments like this. You can never be too prepared, especially when you're deep in the woods. There's no cell service, no one around to help. It's just you and nature. If something goes wrong, you're on your own. The mountain lion didn't move, not at first. It just watched me. It was hard to tell how far away it was. Probably no more than 30 feet, maybe less. But in the dark, in the stillness, it might as well have been inches away. I started backing up, careful not to make a sound. The last thing I needed was for it to feel threatened or cornered. It wasn't just the lion's eyes that bothered me. It was that feeling again. That sensation of being watched, of being the prey. It wasn't just in my head. I knew it. As I moved back, I kept the beam of the flashlight steady. I didn't want to take my eyes off it in case it moved. But slowly, I started to realize something else. The forest around me was too quiet. The usual rustling of animals, the chirping of insects, even the wind in the trees, gone. The entire forest had gone silent, and that only made the feeling worse. I wasn't alone. Something else was out there, something that had been watching me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just the mountain lion. I kept moving, inch by inch, my feet crunching softly on the forest floor, trying not to make any noise. My flashlight moved slowly back and forth. I wanted to scream for my friends, to get them to turn around, but I knew that would just draw the lion closer. Then suddenly the light hit something else. Just for a moment, a flicker of movement in the trees. Something large, something fast. My heart raced and I gripped the flashlight tighter. Was it the lion? Was it another animal? I couldn't see anything clearly, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up again. This was it. I could feel it. The presence was closing in. I didn't stop moving, though. I couldn't let myself get stuck in the woods at night, not with a mountain lion or whatever else lurking around. I kept my pace steady, pushing forward. I was breathing too fast, too shallow, but I made it in time. I caught up with my friends, who still hadn't noticed anything. I didn't tell them right away. I didn't want to make them nervous, but I did feel the weight of it. They'd never know how close we were to disaster. We finally reached the campsite, a small clearing next to the stream. We set up our tents in silence, the strange feeling still gnawing at my gut. The fire crackled as we sat around it, but even that couldn't shake the tension in the air. I stayed close to the fire, my eyes scanning the treeline. The darkness felt thicker now, as if the forest itself was pressing in on us. I kept my pistol close. My heart never really stopped racing. We didn't hear anything that night. No footsteps, no growls, nothing. The mountain lion, or whatever it was, didn't come closer, but I could still feel it out there, in the distance, watching us, waiting. The next morning, we packed up and got out of there quicker than I wanted. I never saw the lion again, but the feeling, the memory, stayed with me. Couldn't shake it. And now, whenever I go into the wilderness, whenever I set up camp in some isolated place, that same fear comes back. The same knowledge that something out there is watching, waiting for the right moment. You'd better believe I keep the pistol close now. It's not just about being prepared. It's about being sure you're not alone when the dark closes in. A few years ago, I moved to a tiny town tucked away in the woods, somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains. The place had a population of about 300 people, and it felt like the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. I had taken the job as a freelance writer, working from my laptop, and I wanted a change of pace, some peace and quiet away from the bustle of city life. I rented a small cabin situated on the edge of the forest, right next to a rural highway that connected a few sleepy towns. The cabin wasn't big, but it had enough room for me and my dog, Max, a large mixed breed with a stubborn streak. It was peaceful, and I liked the isolation, even if it was a little eerie at times. The woods were thick around the cabin, and the highway was just a distant hum, barely noticeable unless a vehicle passed by. One day, I was out walking Max when I heard 2 gunshots coming from somewhere nearby. They were loud and sharp, echoing off the mountains. I didn't think much of it at the time. This was a hunting area, after all, and it was common to hear gunshots in the distance. The locals didn't really care to keep it quiet. In fact, they seemed to embrace the rough-and-tumble lifestyle that went hand-in-hand with hunting and a bit of a redneck culture. Still, something about the shots made me uneasy, but I shrugged it off. A couple of days later, I was in the yard, enjoying the sunshine when a truck pulled up to the driveway. I didn't recognize the vehicle, and I definitely didn't recognize the man who got out. He was tall, with scruffy facial hair and a weathered look about him. His eyes were cold, almost too intense, and his smile was tight, like he was forcing himself to be friendly. I had no idea who he was, but he called out to me and said, "Hey, you're my neighbor, right?" At first, I thought I had misheard him. Neighbor? I didn't know anyone around here. The closest house was over a half-mile away, hidden by trees and a few winding trails. Still, I waved and walked over to him, curious. He told me his name was Hank. He claimed he lived in a cabin not too far away, and that he'd noticed me walking Max every day. I didn't ask him how he knew that, but it gave me an uncomfortable feeling. Hank then asked me if I'd heard the gunshots from the other day. I said yes, I had. He went on to explain that it was his neighbor, someone living several acres away, who had been shooting at his house over a land dispute. He didn't seem angry or scared, just matter of fact, like it was a regular occurrence. "Just wanted to know if you heard it," he said, almost like he was testing me. "Don't suppose you'd be willing to be a witness, would you?" The way he said it made me feel like he wasn't really asking, more like he was fishing for something, information maybe, or an excuse to justify whatever was going on. I told him I wasn't involved, and he seemed to accept that. But he lingered, and I started to get the sense that he wasn't done with me. That's when he noticed Max digging around a patch of dirt in the yard. Max wasn't a fan of new people, especially men, and he wasn't exactly friendly when Hank approached him. I tried to call Max back, but Hank insisted on showing me how to handle him. "I'm a great dog trainer," Hank said, his voice a little too insistent. Before I could protest, he reached down and grabbed Max, pinning him onto his back as if he were going to teach him some kind of dominance technique. Max started yelping, panicked, and I immediately shouted at Hank to stop. He looked at me, unfazed, and gave Max a few more pats before releasing him. "That's how you get a dog to respect you," Hank said, his voice low and casual. My stomach churned. I didn't care what his idea of training was. I wasn't about to let him touch Max again. But Hank wasn't done. He asked me if I had any guns. I said no, trying to keep the conversation as short as possible. "That's all right," he said. "I'm a big fan of firearms myself. You should get yourself something. Always good to be prepared." At this point, I was feeling more than a little uncomfortable, but I didn't want to seem rude. Hank continued by asking if I'd be willing to help him out with some chores at his place, including mowing his lawn. But the way he phrased it, it wasn't just asking. It was like a demand, masked in the guise of politeness. "Please make sure you bring Max when you come," Hank said, his tone just a little too insistent. "I'm sure he'd like the exercise." I nodded quickly, unsure of what else to say, and he climbed back into his truck and left. I stood there for a moment, the silence of the woods settling back in around me. But something about that encounter didn't sit right. It wasn't the invitation to help with his lawn. It was the way he'd insisted on me bringing Max. It felt like a test, but for what? The unease lingered as I went back inside the cabin. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just encountered someone dangerous. I'd given him my phone number, thinking he was just another eccentric neighbor, but now I regretted it. What if he was actually the one causing the trouble with the gunshots? What if he wasn't telling me the truth about his neighbor? What if I had just become part of something much darker than I could imagine? Over the next few days, Hank kept showing up. He would text me, asking why I hadn't come over to mow his lawn yet. When I didn't reply, he'd call, leaving increasingly insistent messages. Something about it all felt off, like he was trying to draw me into his world, make me part of his plans. The worst part was that I didn't know how far he might go to get what he wanted. Then, a couple of the local shopkeepers told me more about Hank. He wasn't just some lonely guy who had lost his wife and his job, as he'd claimed. He had a reputation in the town, one that sent a chill down my spine. They said he was the most hated man in the valley, a man with a violent temper, a heavy drinking problem, and a past full of questionable decisions. I didn't know the details, but I could tell from the way they spoke that they didn't want to say too much. That was all I needed to hear. Hank was dangerous. I started locking the doors at night, checking the windows every few minutes, and carrying my knife with me everywhere I went. It wasn't that I thought Hank would show up at my door with a shotgun. It was more the fear that I didn't know what he was capable of. What if he had done something worse than just shooting at his neighbor's house? What if he'd killed someone, and I had just told him that I'd heard the shots? The worst night came a few weeks later. I was lying in bed, Max curled up at my feet, when I heard a low growl from him. At first, I thought it was just a dream, but then the growl turned into a deeper, more insistent sound. Max's hackles were raised, and he was staring at the door, his body rigid. I didn't hear anything, but the silence in the cabin was deafening. My heart started racing. I grabbed my knife from the bedside table and, with shaking hands, pulled out the bear spray. I locked myself in the bathroom, crouched in the corner, and listened. For hours, it felt like I was waiting for something to happen. The tension in the air was suffocating, and I couldn't shake the image of Hank creeping up to my cabin with a gun in hand, intent on finishing what he'd started. When the sun finally came up, I was still in the bathroom, exhausted, but too afraid to leave. I hadn't heard anything all night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there. I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't stay in a place where I felt so vulnerable. A few days later, I packed up all my things, my clothes, my laptop, and Max, and I left. The small town had already driven me to my breaking point. I didn't even bother to give Hank a reason or explanation. I just left. It wasn't worth it. As I drove out of the valley, I looked back one last time. The mountains loomed dark and silent in the distance, and the woods felt suffocating. It wasn't just Hank. The entire town was strange, full of people who had too much time on their hands and too little to do. I couldn't stay in a place like that. It was too dangerous. I never went back. It was a cool autumn morning, the kind where the air carries a crisp bite to it, and the smell of earth and wet leaves fills your nostrils. I was out walking in the woods, trying to get in a few hours of upland bird hunting before the day got too warm. The sky was overcast, and the clouds hung low, pressing down on the thick canopy of trees above me. The trail I was walking on was little more than a faint path through the bush, with rocks and fallen branches making the footing uneven. I had a good mile or so of walking ahead of me, and the silence of the woods was soothing, like the kind of quiet you can only get deep in the wilderness. My boots crunched softly against the forest floor, the only sound beside the occasional rustle of a bird or squirrel in the brush. I'd done this 1,000 times before. Just me, the rifle slung over my shoulder, looking for birds. There was nothing unusual about it. I'd hunted in these woods for years, ever since I was a kid, but today felt different. There was something unsettling about the stillness, something I couldn't quite place. As I moved through the woods, I noticed a slight dip in the terrain ahead, a small valley that could cut across some of the rougher parts of the trail. It wasn't a shortcut I took often, but it wasn't out of the way either. The valley was a small, natural depression where the trees were a little more sparse, and the ground was more marshy, with the occasional patch of exposed rock. I figured I'd save some time and cut through there, so I angled my way downhill. The path here was a little harder to navigate, but it wasn't a big deal. I made my way carefully through the uneven terrain, taking in the beauty of the landscape around me. The sun had just started to peek through the clouds, casting rays of light that danced across the wet leaves. The whole scene looked peaceful, almost serene. But as I neared the bottom of the valley, something caught my attention. A figure standing in the middle of the trail. It was a man, tall but gaunt, with a rough, unkempt look about him. The first thing that hit me was how out of place he seemed. There was nothing normal about his presence in these woods. The way he was standing, still like a statue, instantly set off alarm bells in my head. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, my gut tightening in that way it does when something's off, but you can't immediately explain why. He was holding an AR-15 rifle, its barrel pointing down but ready to be raised at a moment's notice. His posture wasn't quite relaxed, but it wasn't aggressive either, just unsettlingly neutral. I had no idea who this guy was, and I didn't want to find out, not in the middle of nowhere like this. I tried to keep my voice steady, forcing myself to speak calmly, even though the adrenaline in my veins was already starting to surge. "Hey, just out bird hunting. How are you doing?" I said, trying to keep the conversation light. He didn't answer immediately. There was a long pause as he looked at me, his gaze cold and unblinking. Then he responded in a monotone voice that sent a chill through me. "Fine." He paused again. "I'm hunting deer." I instantly knew something was wrong. Deer season wasn't open. The rifle he was carrying wasn't legal for deer hunting either. It was a semi-automatic, far too powerful for a hunt like that. And his clothes, his whole appearance, weren't what you'd expect from someone who knew what they were doing out here. He was dressed in ragged, dirty clothes, old, worn-out jeans and a jacket that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. His face was scruffy, with a beard that was more patchy than full, and his eyes were sunken, dark, as though he hadn't slept in days. He looked like someone who hadn't cared about hygiene or self-preservation for a long time. His whole appearance screamed of neglect. It was the kind of look that made you wonder if he was lost or if he had intentionally chosen to step off the grid. I tried to keep my tone even, trying to gauge the situation. "Do you know the best way for me to go to find some birds?" His response was sharp, almost like a snap. "Well, I imagine you might find some back the way you came." The way he said it, that "back the way you came," made the hairs on my neck stand up even more. It wasn't just an offhand suggestion, it was a warning. A clear signal that I wasn't supposed to be there, that I should turn around and leave. I didn't know what was down the trail behind him, but I had a gut feeling that I didn't want to find out. I took a deep breath and slowly started to back up, trying to maintain a calm demeanor, not wanting to provoke any kind of reaction. The last thing I needed was a confrontation with someone who seemed so unpredictable. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me as I stepped back onto the trail, but he didn't move. His eyes followed me, and I didn't stop until I had put enough distance between us. I could hear his boots shifting in the dirt behind me, but I didn't turn around. I didn't want to know if he was following me. I just kept walking, slowly at first, then a little faster as I felt the anxiety building up in my chest. Once I reached a more open part of the trail, I picked up the pace, putting more distance between us. My heart was pounding, my thoughts racing, trying to process what had just happened. Who was this guy? What was he doing out there with that gun? The more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. There were no deer season rules that lined up with what he'd said. That rifle wasn't meant for hunting anything in these woods. He wasn't dressed for hunting, and he didn't look like someone who was even capable of surviving in the wilderness, not in the state he was in. I had no idea what was going on, but the fact that he'd been standing there so silently, so still, was unnerving. I hadn't heard him coming, which meant he had been there for some time, watching me or waiting for someone else. When I finally made it back to the truck, my body was still buzzing with adrenaline. I don't know what I expected to happen out there, but I knew it wasn't this. I was shaken, trying to piece it together, but I didn't have any answers. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't sleep, and every creak of the house made me jump. The next morning, I went to the sheriff's office and reported the incident. I told them everything. How the man had been standing there with the rifle, how strange he looked, how the whole situation felt wrong from the very beginning. The sheriff took down my information, promised to look into it, but I never heard back from them. They didn't seem overly concerned. They probably chalked it up to some homeless guy wandering around in the woods, but the way that man had looked, the way he acted, it didn't sit right with me. I didn't go back to that trail for a long time. In fact, I haven't been back since. That place, the one where I thought I could cut through the valley to save some time, no longer feels safe. I can't shake the feeling that there's something else out there in the woods, something I'll never fully understand. And maybe that's for the best. Some things are better left unknown. It was supposed to be a peaceful hike. My mom and I had planned it for weeks. We were heading into the mountains for a day trip, hoping to catch some fresh air, get some exercise, and spend some time in nature. My dog, Daisy, was coming along too, as always. She was a medium-sized mixed breed with a bit of border collie in her, so she loved hikes. She had boundless energy, and nothing seemed to faze her. At least that's what I thought. We set off early in the morning, the sun just starting to peek over the ridge as we arrived at the trailhead. It was mid-fall, the leaves still holding onto their golden hues, but the air was crisp with that sharp edge that only autumn can bring. We parked the car, grabbed our backpacks, and leashed up Daisy. She was wagging her tail, excited to get going. There was something about the smell of the woods that seemed to calm me, as if nature had a way of telling me everything would be okay. We started up the trail, the ground covered in fallen leaves that crunched beneath our boots. The path wound through dense trees, their trunks standing tall and proud, the air thick with the earthy scent of pine and damp wood. Daisy trotted along beside us, her leash held firmly in my hand, her ears perked, eyes scanning the woods as we moved along. At first, everything felt perfectly normal. We talked about how nice it was to get away from everything for a while, how peaceful the forest was, how great it felt to leave the chaos of daily life behind. Daisy was having the time of her life, sniffing every tree and bush along the way, occasionally stopping to sniff the air, her nose twitching as if she could smell something in the distance. But then, around an hour into the hike, something changed. Daisy, who had been walking happily beside us, suddenly froze. She stopped dead in her tracks and turned her head, her eyes wide and alert. Her body went rigid. I could feel the tension in the leash as she pulled against it, her muscles taut. I stopped too, glancing around, but I saw nothing unusual. The woods were quiet, save for the occasional bird chirp and the rustling of leaves in the wind. My mom, who had been walking a few feet ahead, turned around and saw Daisy's behavior. "What's wrong with her?" my mom asked, her voice low, as if she sensed something was off too. I shook my head. "I don't know. She's acting weird." Daisy kept staring into the trees, her ears flattened against her head. She wasn't just alert, she was terrified. Her body was trembling, and the look in her eyes was unlike anything I had ever seen. I'd seen her nervous before, but this was different. This was pure, unadulterated fear. I tried to call her name, but she wouldn't respond. She just stared into the distance, her gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. For a moment, I thought maybe there was an animal nearby, a deer perhaps, or maybe even a bear, something that had caught her attention. But the woods were silent. There was no rustling, no movement. The only sound was the wind brushing through the trees. My mom stepped closer to Daisy, trying to calm her down, but Daisy backed away from her, still shaking. She was tugging at the leash now, desperate to get away from whatever she was sensing. "Okay, this is freaking me out," I muttered, my voice shaking a little. "Why is she acting like this? We should turn back," my mom said, her tone more serious now. "Something's not right." I agreed. Something about the way Daisy was acting, how she was so scared, felt wrong. She wasn't the type of dog to panic over nothing. She had a sixth sense, and whatever it was that had her spooked, I didn't want to find out. I started to lead Daisy back down the trail, but she wasn't having it. She fought me, pulling hard at the leash, her paws skidding on the dirt as she tried to go in the opposite direction. The more I pulled, the more she resisted. It was like she was fighting for her life, and I couldn't understand why. There was nothing around us, no sign of any predator or danger. Just the woods, the quiet, and the feeling that something was off. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but then I heard it. A soft sound, barely perceptible at first, a rustle in the brush behind us. It was so faint, I almost thought it was my imagination. But then I heard it again, a low sound that sent a chill down my spine. My heart started pounding in my chest. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My mom must have heard it too because she stopped, her face going pale. "Daisy!" I shouted, tugging harder on the leash to get her moving. "Let's go." But Daisy was still frozen, her head turned sharply toward the noise. Her body was shaking now, and her breath came in quick, shallow gasps. She was terrified, and I was beginning to realize why. It was then that I saw it, a flicker of movement just beyond the trees. I couldn't see much, but I saw something large moving through the underbrush, its shape barely visible in the shadows. My blood ran cold. "Mom, do you see that?" I whispered, my voice tight with fear. My mom didn't answer right away. She was staring at the same spot I was, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Is that a mountain lion?" she asked, her voice low and trembling. I didn't know what it was, but I knew one thing: we were being stalked. Whatever was in those woods was watching us, and it wasn't a good feeling. I could feel the weight of its presence in the air, thick and suffocating. Daisy finally broke, lunging forward as if to run, but I held tight to the leash. She yelped in panic, trying to drag me away from the trail, her body shaking uncontrollably. She was in full flight mode, her instincts telling her to run, but I couldn't let go of her leash. I had to hold her back. We backed up slowly, my eyes scanning the trees, looking for any sign of the predator. Every rustle, every crack of a twig had me on edge. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something large watching us from the shadows. Every nerve in my body was screaming for us to leave, to get out of there as fast as we could. My mom was starting to panic too, her voice shaking as she said, "We need to get out of here now." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, carefully, we began to retreat, keeping Daisy close. She was still pulling against the leash, still desperate to get away from whatever was out there. We didn't speak as we made our way back down the trail. All I could hear was the sound of my own breathing, the rapid thump of my heartbeat, and the rustling of the leaves underfoot. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we reached the parking lot. Daisy was still on edge, but as soon as we stepped onto the gravel, she seemed to relax slightly. My mom and I got in the car, locking the doors as if the act of being inside would somehow shield us from whatever was in the woods. I looked back toward the trailhead one last time before we drove off. The woods seemed normal again, quiet, peaceful even. But I knew better. We had narrowly escaped something that could have turned deadly, and I was thankful we were both there to help each other through it. But what if we hadn't been? What if I had been alone, like some of the other hikers who go off the beaten path, thinking nothing could go wrong? It sent a cold shiver through me. It was a reminder. Nature is beautiful, but it's also dangerous, unpredictable. And we were lucky we made it out that day, with nothing more than our nerves rattled. The rest of the drive was quiet. Daisy was no longer shaking, but she stayed close to me, her head resting on my lap as if she was trying to calm herself. I was still processing everything that had happened. My mom and I exchanged only a few words, both of us lost in our thoughts. As we turned the corner onto the main road, I couldn't help but feel grateful. We had made it out. We had listened to Daisy, trusted her instincts, and turned back when it was clear that something wasn't right. And that was the most important thing. We may not have seen the mountain lion, but we knew it was there, and that was enough. I was stationed at a small army base in Colorado back in 2011. I was 22 years old and fresh into active duty. The base wasn't one of those massive, sprawling installations. It was tucked away in the hills, kind of remote, and had this weird mixture of old training buildings, thick forested areas, and a bunch of half-forgotten trails winding through the trees. People joked that it was the Army's forgotten corner. It didn't feel like a real base, more like someone's idea of a summer camp crossed with a low-budget war zone training center. That week, we had a field training exercise. Just one of those basic unit readiness drills where they toss you out in the woods and expect you to pretend it's a combat zone. Nothing fancy. We'd done it a few times before, but this time felt different. Not because of the mission itself, but because of how deep into the woods they sent us. We had LMTVs packed with gear, and they dropped us way out where there weren't even any established bivouac sites. No cleared areas, just raw terrain, thick brush, and a whole lot of silence once the engines shut off. We set up camp about 2 clicks from the main dirt road. A few camo nets, sleeping mats, MREs, and the basics. We were told to treat it like an overnight deployment. Stay alert, no noise, stay camouflaged. I was posted with a squad of 9 other guys. All of us were young, relatively new, and still figuring things out. The first night went as expected. Cold, boring, and filled with awkward shuffling as people tried to get comfortable on the ground. You get used to sleeping in a helmet and boots after a while, but not on the first few nights. Most of us took shifts for watch, and I had the 0100 to 0300 shift. It was uneventful, just a lot of staring into the trees and hearing random twigs snap. Could have been anything: squirrels, birds, maybe a coyote, but nothing really worth worrying about. The second night was when things got strange. Right around 22:30, we were doing a quick equipment check before lights out. That's when we noticed the first sign. A few MREs had gone missing. Not misplaced, gone. The boxes had been opened and not cleanly. Torn, shredded, like something had dug into them. At first, we figured someone got hungry and decided to sneak an extra meal or two. But then we found one of the MRE wrappers about 40 yards from camp, out by a tree line. That's when someone mumbled, "Raccoons." Now, back home in Indiana where I grew up, raccoons were trash can burglars. Annoying, sure, but not bold. They waited for people to go to bed. They knocked over bins, made a mess, and scattered when you turned on a porch light. But these were built different. That night, we heard them. Heavy scampering, growling. Not the kind you hear from some little possum or squirrel. It was louder, more organized, if that makes sense. I could swear they were working in a group. We kept our gear zipped up and our food packed inside one of the LMTVs. We figured that'd keep them out. Wrong. Around 0300, we woke up to this high-pitched shrieking. It wasn't an animal noise. It was someone screaming. One of the drill sergeants. The guy was known for being loud and mean, the kind of guy who could tear you down with a single look. But now he was shrieking like someone dumped ice water down his back. There was also this repeated clatter of metal and boots slamming into the floor of the truck. And then what sounded like blanks being fired. A few of us ran toward the LMTV. What we saw will stick with me forever. The back flap of the truck was swinging wide open. Inside, chaos. Flashlight beams darted across the walls, and we saw at least 4, maybe 5 raccoons darting in and out with full MREs. I swear they weren't just grabbing and running. They were organizing. One would jump in, grab a pack, toss it down to another on the ground, and then bolt. It was like watching some kind of tactical extraction. The drill sergeant inside was stomping around, swinging a flashlight, and letting off blanks into the air. It didn't do a thing. The raccoons didn't scatter. They waited for an opening, darted in, and kept grabbing packs. One of them even took off with a spoon in its mouth. Eventually, the sergeant stopped firing. The noise quieted. The raccoons, satisfied or bored, scattered into the trees. They were gone in seconds. We were left standing there, stunned. The LMTV looked like it had been looted. Open boxes, torn wrappers, utensils everywhere. Probably $200 worth of food. Just gone. We spent the next hour picking up scraps. No one said much. There wasn't anything to say. We locked everything down tighter that night, double-zipped tents, taped over the crate lids, and even placed someone on guard duty just to watch the food. Next morning, we reported the incident up the chain. They just laughed, told us raccoons on that base were a different breed. One of the older guys mentioned they'd seen them pry open ammo cans before. Someone else swore they once watched a raccoon drag an entire duffel bag across the dirt for 30 minutes straight before giving up. The general attitude was, don't mess with them. They were here first. It didn't end there, though. For the next 3 nights, they came back. Not in huge numbers, but enough to make our lives difficult. We tried everything. Extra locks, hanging food from trees, even played loud music off a radio. They didn't care. They just adapted. Came from different angles. Dug under things. We watched them test stuff. Tug at zippers, scratch at bins, push over our field chairs just to see what was underneath. It felt less like an infestation and more like a siege. By the 4th night, our team was exhausted. No one had proper rest. The drill sergeants, embarrassed and annoyed, started taking things more seriously. They set up traps, but the raccoons either avoided them or somehow tripped them without getting caught. One morning, we found one of the traps empty but closed, with a chewed-up pine cone inside, like they were mocking us. Eventually, they gave up. We moved our camp back closer to the main road, toward the more frequently used field sites. And just like that, the raccoons stopped bothering us. It was like they had their territory, and once we left it, they lost interest. That final morning, as we loaded the trucks, I looked back toward the tree line. I swear I saw one of them sitting on a log, just watching. Not afraid, not hiding, just observing, like we were the entertainment. Years later, I still think about that week. I've been through some rough assignments, but nothing compares to feeling like you're being outsmarted by a bunch of woodland trash pandas. We lost probably 24 MREs, a box of utensils, a sleeping mat, and someone's poncho. The base never reimbursed us. And yeah, I still laugh thinking about that drill sergeant screaming and firing off blanks like he was under attack. Lesson learned? Military animals don't play by the same rules. And if you're ever camping out on base, keep your food locked up tighter than your weapon. Because out there, the raccoons don't just want your snacks, they want to win. When I was growing up in the late 90s, my family made it a tradition to go camping every summer. We didn't have a lot of money for big vacations or flights, but we had a small pop-up camper and a couple of tents, and we made the most of it. My parents always said those were the best memories they had as kids, and they wanted the same for me and my younger brother. Every June or July, we'd pack up the van and head off for a week, usually sticking to the East Coast. Our go-to spots rotated between Myrtle Beach in South Carolina, Cape Hatteras in North Carolina, and this rougher, more primitive place in Maryland called Maple Isle. Maple Isle wasn't really an island, but the name stuck. It was this wild strip of land along the Atlantic, dotted with pockets of marshland, patches of scrubby pine, and a long strip of sandy beach. The place was known for its wild ponies that wandered the area freely, a big draw for families and photographers. There were no fences keeping them out, and they pretty much did whatever they wanted. Some years they came right through the campground. It was supposed to be charming, but honestly, it could get weird and messy. They'd go through your cooler or trample your stuff if you left it out. My dad hated dealing with that, but my mom always loved being close to nature, so we kept coming back. That particular summer, I was around 10, maybe 11. It was the summer after my 5th grade year. We got to the campground after a long drive from our house in central Pennsylvania. The air was sticky the moment we stepped out of the van, the kind of heat that made your shirt cling to your back before you even finished setting up your gear. My dad and I put up 2 tents, one for him and my little brother, and one for my mom and me. My mom always liked splitting us like that when we brought tents. She said she slept better not being next to Dad snoring, and I was too young to sleep alone, so I always bunked with her. We picked a site that was close to the beach but set back enough that we had a little cover from some low, scrubby trees and tall grass. There were signs everywhere warning campers not to feed or approach the wild ponies, and to store food securely, but we'd been there before and knew the routine. There was a small, sandy trail near our tent that led through the trees and down toward the dunes. It was just wide enough to walk single file, and I remember my mom saying we should be careful of snakes when walking it barefoot. The first couple of days were normal. Hot, loud with bugs, and kind of fun in the way camping is when you're a kid. We spent most of the day on the beach. My brother and I dug holes and built things in the sand while my dad fished and my mom read under an umbrella. Every now and then you'd see the ponies walking up or down the beach in a line, sometimes near the water, sometimes cutting through the campsites. I'd always stop and stare. They weren't small like I thought ponies were supposed to be. Some of them were muscular and looked half wild, with tangled manes and flies circling their backs. My dad warned us to stay away from them, said they could bite or kick if they felt threatened. So we watched from a distance. The nights were tougher. I was a light sleeper, and the sounds of the bugs and the rustling outside the tent kept me up. The first night I thought I heard something brushing up against the tent wall, but when I unzipped the flap and peeked out, I saw nothing. The next night was windier and a little cooler. It felt good after the heat of the day, and I remember falling asleep quicker. It was the 3rd night that stuck with me. It was late, and the campground had gone quiet. You could still hear the waves if you listened carefully, along with the faint hum of insects and the occasional rustle from some animal moving through the brush. I was sleeping in a thin sleeping bag next to my mom, curled up with a small flashlight under my pillow. I woke up because I felt her move. She sat up straight, like she'd been jolted awake, but she didn't make a sound. I blinked a few times and rubbed my eyes. The moonlight was coming through the mesh window on the side of the tent, casting a bluish glow across the inside. It was just bright enough to make out shapes. I looked at her and followed her gaze. She was staring straight ahead, completely still, not breathing heavily, not whispering or fumbling for anything, just sitting upright, staring out the mesh window that faced the small trail toward the beach. I pushed myself up slowly, starting to feel nervous. Something about her stillness unsettled me. That's when I saw it. At first, I didn't know what I was looking at. It was a silhouette against the pale glow of the moonlight, framed by the window screen. It looked like a woman, an old woman standing just outside our tent, leaning forward slightly like she was trying to peer in. Her hair looked long and wiry, like seaweed or an old mop, and it moved slightly in the breeze. Her head was tilted in this strange way, and her arms hung down loosely at her sides. She wasn't moving. My heart started pounding. I didn't know what to do. I stared at my mom, trying to figure out why she wasn't saying anything, why she wasn't doing something. I wanted to say something, to ask who it was, but the fear locked me up. When I finally worked up the nerve to whisper her name, my voice cracked. That tiny sound, just a short whisper, was enough. The shape outside suddenly jerked and took off. It moved fast, faster than I expected. Not like an old woman at all. It crashed through the brush, hoofs kicking up sand and dirt as it bolted down the trail toward the dunes. That's when I realized what it really was. It wasn't a person. It was one of the wild ponies. The wiry hair I saw was its tangled mane, and the weird, tilted head was just the angle of its long face looking into the mesh window. The moonlight and my sleepy brain had turned it into something completely different. My mom looked at me then and let out a long, quiet breath. We didn't say anything, but I could tell she had been just as fooled as I was. The next morning, we found tracks around the tent. The sand was soft enough that you could make out the hoof prints clearly, and they led down the trail toward the beach. One of the rangers we spoke to later said the ponies sometimes used those narrow paths to get from the inland marsh to the water at night. Our tent had been set up just a couple feet off their usual route. He said we were lucky it didn't try to push through or spook harder, because they've been known to panic and damage property if they feel cornered. We stayed the rest of the week, but we moved our tents the next day to a more open spot closer to the central fire pit area. I didn't sleep well the rest of the trip, and even after we got home, it took me a while to stop thinking about that moment. Waking up, seeing that figure, and thinking something terrible was standing just outside. Looking back now, it's one of those stories that sticks in your mind not because something bad happened, but because of how close it felt to something bad. I think about how fragile our sense of safety is out in places like that, how easy it is for your brain to twist shapes and shadows into monsters. But the truth was, it was just a pony, a living animal doing what it had always done, walking its path down to the water like it probably had for years. I haven't camped on Maple Isle again since I moved out and started my own life, but I haven't forgotten that trip. Every time I see a horse now, especially one with a long, messy mane, I think about that night, and I always check where I'm pitching my tent, just in case I'm blocking something older and more accustomed to the land than I am. It was the summer of 2014 when my wife and I decided to go on a camping trip in northern Minnesota. We'd both grown up doing trips like this with our families and missed being out in the woods, away from everything. I was 34 at the time, she was 32. We picked a forested area just east of Bemidji. The place was thick with jack pine and hardly any undergrowth, just dry pine needles on hard ground. There was a small semi-maintained campground tucked off a dirt logging road. No signage, no reservations, just a handful of scattered spots with rusted-out fire pits and the kind of picnic tables that left splinters in your legs. We arrived midweek. It was supposed to be a quiet 5-day trip. Just us, our dog Molly, and the woods. First couple of nights were uneventful. Hot during the day, cool at night. Mosquitoes were brutal, but we brought netting and plenty of bug dope. On the third day, I noticed the wind picking up. Not just a breeze either. It came in gusts, kicking dust up off the ground and hissing through the trees like an oncoming train. The sky was still blue, but the sound in the forest changed. Anyone who's camped in jack pine country knows that when wind gets up into those spindly trees, it's not like other forests. Jack pine don't have deep roots. They grow fast and shallow. When the wind gets serious, they go down like matchsticks. By late afternoon, the wind was howling. I reinforced the guy lines on our tent, double-staked everything. I could see tops of trees bending, swaying dangerously. Some had that cracking, groaning sound. That night, the wind didn't let up. Around midnight, I heard a tree fall. It wasn't far away. The ground shook a little. The dog whimpered, pressed against me. Another crash, even closer. Then I started hearing smaller branches hitting the tent, pine cones, needles, debris. At one point, I got up and went out with a headlamp. I didn't want to, but I had to check the surroundings. That light cut through blowing dust and needles, and I could see one tree had gone down right across the access road. If we needed to leave, we were trapped. I went back to the tent, heart thudding. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, just lay there listening to the chaos. We didn't get crushed. Nothing came down on us. But when morning came, the place looked like a war zone. Fallen trees all over, snapped trunks, a mess of branches. We packed up and left early. Had to clear a path with a handsaw and winch on the truck. Took hours. We were filthy, scraped up, exhausted. But we got out. That storm shook me. Never thought I'd be scared of wind, but that night changed something. A few years later, around 2017, I went on a trip with my best friend. I'll call him Mark. We used to go camping in more out-of-the-way spots. One place we liked was up in northern Alberta, maybe 3 hours north of Edmonton. It was semi-remote, technically a wreck site, but the road in was nothing but a rutted 2-track through muskeg and sand. You needed a high-clearance 4x4 to get in, especially if it had rained. We got there on a hot day in July. Place was empty as usual. Couple of old fire rings, rotten picnic tables, and an outhouse that looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in a decade. That was normal. Government crews maybe came out once a year. We were setting up camp when Mark wandered off toward the outhouses. They were just those backcountry wooden kinds, doors hanging half off, spiders everywhere. He came back a few minutes later looking weird. Just said I should go check out the first outhouse. So I walked over, expected something gross. Someone missed the hole or some animal crawled in and died. Opened the door. There wasn't a body or anything, but there were 3 large hiking backpacks stacked inside. They were dirty but in decent shape. Looked expensive. I'd done enough backcountry stuff to know these were serious gear hauling packs, the kind you use for week-long trips. I called Mark over and we pulled the packs out. 2 of them were full of standard gear, sleeping bags, cook kits, freeze-dried food, clothes. Everything neatly packed. No IDs, no tags, nothing with names. The third one was weird. It was stuffed entirely with candy. All Skittles. Big bulk bags, small individual ones, sour, tropical, original. No other food. Just layers of Skittles in every type of packaging. We were both confused. The gear looked used but not trashed. No signs of animals chewing through anything. We figured someone maybe stashed it and planned to come back. But why hide it in the outhouse? And why all the candy? No clue. We left it where we found it. We camped 4 nights and never saw a single person. Not a soul. The bags were still in the outhouse when we left. On our way back to civilization, we let the COs know about it. They didn't seem surprised. Just said they'd send someone to check. I never heard anything else. Still creeps me out. I've done enough backcountry trips to know you don't just leave good gear behind, especially not stashed in a latrine. And nobody packs 80 liters of Skittles for a wilderness trip. It didn't feel right. Then there was the time I took Molly out for a solo overnight hike. This was in the spring of 2019, not far from Valemount, British Columbia. I was living in Kamloops then and wanted a quick escape. Drove out on a whim, found a trail I hadn't done before, parked off a Forest Service road, and hiked in a few kilometers. Didn't bring a tent, just a tarp and some paracord. It was one of those setups where you string the tarp low to the ground like a lean-to, leave one side open. Had a small fire going, just enough to keep warm. No big setup. Didn't expect anyone around. I wasn't hiding, but I wasn't lighting the forest up either. Around midnight, I was just dozing off when I heard it. A truck engine. Loud, close, accelerating hard. I froze. Molly perked up, ears twitching. Then came voices. Drunk, shouting, hooting. Then gunshots. Not just one or two. A whole magazine, maybe more. Sounded like they were close. Maybe a few hundred meters through the trees. I realized I must have been near another access road. I hadn't seen it on the map. The way the land rose and dipped, they could have been on a ridge or down in a gully. But it sounded like the shots were coming in my direction. I didn't wait. Got up, packed what I could in 10 minutes flat. Snuffed the fire, yanked down the tarp, leashed Molly tight, and hiked out in the dark. Didn't use a light, just went by feel, head low, listening. Every gunshot made my heart jump. Kept going for maybe 20 minutes. Got back to the truck and didn't even stop to sort gear. Just threw it in the back and drove. I must have gone 30 kilometers before I stopped to breathe. Never found out who they were or what they were shooting at. Maybe it was just a drunken party. Maybe they didn't know I was there. But I still think about how easily that could have gone bad. One stray bullet. One idiot wandering too far from the fire. After that, I started picking my spots more carefully. Never camped without checking every road and trail nearby. I stopped going solo as much. The woods still call to me, and I still go, but that blind trust one used to have, gone. All those years, all those trips, and the scariest moments were never from animals or whether you could plan for. It was the people, or the things people left behind. I still camp, still love it, but I've learned that the danger doesn't always come with a warning. Sometimes it's silent and strange, like a pack of candy hidden in an outhouse. Sometimes it's loud and chaotic, like bullets cracking through trees in the middle of the night. But you keep going, you stay smart, and you never forget how quickly it can all go sideways. That's what keeps you sharp. That's what keeps you alive out there. It was the summer of 2012 when my older brother Jake, younger sister Emily, and I went on a weekend camping trip to West Elm Lake in northern Michigan. I was 22 at the time, Jake was 25, and Emily had just turned 19. We grew up going on camping trips with our parents, but this time it was just the three of us. Jake had borrowed our cousin's old pop-up tent, and I had packed up the cooler with some drinks, hot dogs, and a bag of chips that we were sure wouldn't last the weekend. Emily brought her old guitar and a bag of marshmallows that melted a little in the car on the way up. We weren't exactly professionals, but we were used to roughing it and were excited to spend a couple of days out in the woods together. We left early on a Friday morning and got to the campground by early afternoon. The site we picked was a short walk from the lake. It wasn't a huge campground, maybe a couple dozen spots scattered in a big loop with the lake down a slope on one side and dense pine woods surrounding the rest. It was remote enough to feel peaceful, but close enough to a small town that we weren't totally off the grid. That first afternoon, we unpacked the tent, hammered the stakes down, and set up camp without much trouble. The weather was warm but not too hot, with a light breeze and a blue sky stretching out in all directions. It felt like we had timed it perfectly. After setting up, we took a short hike around the lake, skipped stones on the water, and made a little fire back at the site. By nightfall, we were sitting around the fire roasting marshmallows and just enjoying the quiet. The stars came out one by one, and the breeze off the lake felt cool on our faces. We had no cell service and didn't care. Everything felt calm. The next day, Saturday, the weather started to shift. I noticed the wind picking up a little more than usual in the morning. There were some clouds drifting in from the west, and while it wasn't immediately threatening, something about it felt off. Jake kept saying it was just a normal summer system, nothing to worry about. Still, by afternoon, the wind was steady, and the sky started to turn that strange flat gray that never feels right. We were sitting on the shore in the late afternoon when I saw the first flash of lightning far across the lake. The boom of thunder followed a few seconds later. It was distant but strong. Within an hour, the temperature dropped noticeably. The breeze became a steady wind, and the sky turned darker and darker. I could hear the storm building in the distance. The thunder no longer came in quick bursts. It was rolling, deep and constant, like the growl of something massive and slow moving closer. We packed up our stuff from the shore and headed back to the tent. Jake checked the stakes again, pressing them deeper into the dirt. I helped tighten the guy lines. The wind was really pushing by then, loud in the trees above us. Emily was quiet, holding her jacket closed around her. The lake looked like an ocean at that point, waves churning hard against the rocks and shore. The storm hit just after dusk. It wasn't a typical thunderstorm. It felt like the entire sky was alive with lightning. I had never seen anything like it. Flashes weren't coming in random bolts. They were crawling through the clouds, spidering across the sky in jagged veins of electric light. Every few seconds, the whole campground would light up as if it were noon, then drop back into blackness. The thunder didn't come in claps, came in a constant roar. It didn't stop. It was one endless wave of sound, like a jet engine overhead that just wouldn't pass. The wind came in sudden, violent gusts, battering the sides of our tent. We could feel it lift slightly off the ground every time a stronger gust came through. I could see the fabric rippling hard over our heads, like it might tear. Jake and I both grabbed the tent poles and tried to hold them in place. Emily had her sleeping bag wrapped around her, eyes wide. We looked at each other without speaking. We were all thinking the same thing: we had to get out. We burst out of the tent and ran to the car, not more than 30 feet away. The wind almost knocked Emily over as she opened the back door. We all jumped in and slammed the doors shut. Inside, it was a little quieter, but we could feel the car swaying with every gust. The rain started a few seconds later, hammering the roof and windshield so hard it sounded like gravel. The lightning was still nonstop, and now bolts were striking the lake directly. Huge, blinding flashes lit up the water as we watched, wide-eyed. One hit so close we all jumped. The thunder came instantly, a sickening crack that seemed to hit us in the chest. Then we saw it. The tent, which we had tried to secure just minutes before, lifted off the ground and slammed into a tree on the edge of the campsite. Poles snapped, fabric whipped in the air, and then it was gone. We could barely see through the storm, but I could tell it was ruined. At that point, we knew we couldn't stay there. The car felt like it might flip in the wind, and even though driving didn't seem safe, sitting there felt worse. Jake turned the engine on, and we slowly pulled out of the loop, creeping along the narrow gravel road as branches whipped across the headlights. I remember gripping the handle on the door, half expecting a tree to fall on us. We drove about 20 minutes through the storm, barely able to see the road at times. The roar of thunder never stopped. We finally made it to our grandpa's house, which thankfully had power and was built strong. He wasn't home at the time, he was visiting family out of town, but he had given us a key in case we ever needed it. That night, none of us slept much. The storm raged outside for hours. We sat in the living room, wrapped in blankets, still damp, still shaking from the adrenaline. We turned on the news, and the local channel was covering severe weather all across the region. There were warnings for high winds, flooding, even tornadoes. By morning, the storm had finally passed. We got in the car and drove back to the campground to assess the damage. The closer we got, the more debris we saw. Branches snapped off, trees leaning or down completely, water pooling across low spots in the road. When we arrived, part of the campground loop had been closed off with orange tape. A ranger stood by a parked truck, turning people away. We could see that several trees had fallen over, blocking the loop and crushing one of the picnic tables. He told us a small tornado had touched down somewhere near the lake during the night. We walked to our site from the nearby parking area. The tent was shredded, tangled in the same tree we saw it hit. Our gear was scattered everywhere. Emily's guitar case was under a pile of branches. Some of our food was soaked, and the cooler had rolled halfway into the woods. I never did find my sleeping bag. We spent about an hour picking up what we could, then quietly packed what was left into the car. There wasn't much to say. We were lucky. We hadn't gotten hurt. The car was fine. We had a place to go. but the storm had left a mark on all of us. I had never felt so powerless before. I've seen thunderstorms my whole life, but nothing that alive, nothing that angry. It felt like the sky was trying to tear the earth apart. We drove home in silence for most of the way. Later, we joked about it with friends and tried to play it off like some wild adventure. But there's a part of me that still feels uneasy when a summer storm rolls in. That night at the lake didn't feel like weather. It felt like something more brutal, something that didn't care if we were there or not. I haven't been back to West Elm Lake since. Not because I'm afraid of storms, but because once you see the sky try to rip itself open over your head, it's hard to look at a place the same way again. I was 32 the first time I camped completely alone. It was early spring of 2019, and I had a week off work. I'd just gotten out of a long relationship and needed time away from everything. No screens, no people, no noise, just bush, silence, and time. I live in Victoria, Australia, and picked a spot I'd found while driving through a quieter part of East Gippsland the year before. It was a patch of state forest, not an official campground, but perfectly legal to camp on. A thin dirt track led off the main road for about 5 kilometers until it opened up into a wide flat area surrounded by dense bush. The kind of place you could park your car, walk a bit into the trees, and not see another soul for days. I packed light, just a small tent, a sleeping mat, food for a few days, water containers, a little gas cooker, and the usual bush gear. I had my old Nissan Uda with me, and I parked it off to the side of the clearing. I didn't want it to be right next to my tent, in case I wanted the full alone in the woods experience. I walked about 50 meters into the bush, past where the grass ended and the forest floor turned into dry leaf litter and sticks. The area had that damp earth smell mixed with the sharpness of eucalyptus. I found a good flat spot between some stringy barks and set up camp there. It felt secluded but not too far from the car if I needed to get out. I spent the first day walking around the bush nearby. Not hiking far, just poking around. I found an old fence line about 100 meters out and followed it to a dry creek bed. There were some kangaroo tracks in the soft dirt near the bottom. Nothing unusual. At night, I cooked some pasta on my little stove and sat out listening to the forest sounds. A few possums rustling around, a couple of boo-book owls calling, and the constant clicking of insects. I had a torch and a headlamp, but I kept them off most of the time. The moon was out, and the light filtered through the trees just enough to make out shapes. The bush was dry, lots of leaf litter, dead sticks, and twigs snapping even under small animals. You could hear movement from a fair distance, even if it was just a wallaby hopping past or something in the trees. I liked that. It made me feel like I'd have some warning if anything or anyone came near, but I didn't really expect anything to. It was too remote, and the area wasn't popular with hunters or hikers. That first night went by quietly. I slept fine. A few wakes here and there from random sounds, but nothing that set off alarm bells. I woke up with the sun and made instant coffee on the cooker. I read for a while, explored a bit more, found some interesting old rusted fencing and what might have been the remains of a collapsed shed or shack way off in the distance. Just bits of tin and weathered beams. The second night was when things got weird. It was just after midnight, I think. I had been asleep for maybe 2 or 3 hours. There was no wind, no rustling, nothing. Dead quiet. I remember waking up suddenly. No dream, no nightmare. Just that kind of wake up where you're instantly aware, like something has flicked a switch. My eyes opened, and I was just lying there, breathing shallow. I didn't hear anything at first. Then I did. A single sound. A kind of plopping noise. Not a twig snap, not a rustle, just a single low plop, like something heavy but soft had hit the ground. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far. Maybe 10 meters away. That was it. No footsteps, no animal sounds, nothing. Just that one sound, then silence. I sat up slowly inside the tent and stayed still, listening. My tent is small and dark green, just enough for one person lying down and their bag. I didn't unzip it or shine a light outside. I just sat there in the dark, heart beating hard. I listened for maybe 15 minutes. Nothing. No more movement. Eventually, I lay back down, not taking my eyes off the flap of the tent. I didn't sleep well the rest of the night. I kept half dozing off and snapping awake again, always thinking I'd heard something, but every time it was just silence. I must have eventually fallen asleep properly because the next thing I remember is waking up to early morning light filtering through the tent fabric. I unzipped the flap, still groggy, and sat up to stretch. That's when I saw it. Right next to the tent, not even half a meter from the entrance, was the head of a kangaroo. Just the head. It had clearly been severed, not torn off, but cut clean. The fur was dry, not fresh, but it hadn't been there the night before. I would have seen it. I had cleared the ground around the tent carefully for sticks and stones. The head was just sitting there, propped slightly upright, facing the tent. I stared at it for what felt like minutes. My brain couldn't catch up. I stood up, slowly, and looked around. No other sign of anything. No blood trail, no tracks, nothing dragged through the leaf litter. Just the head placed there. My skin went cold. I suddenly felt like I was being watched. I spun around, checked behind trees, scanned the bush in every direction. Nothing. Nothing moved, nothing made a sound. It was completely still. I didn't waste any more time. I threw my gear into my pack, pulled down the tent without bothering to fold it, and jogged back through the trees toward the Uda. The whole time I was listening, hard, trying to hear if anything was following me, but it was just the crunch of my boots and my breath. I tossed everything in the tray, slammed the doors shut, and got the engine going. The dirt track back out to the main road felt twice as long as when I came in. I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see someone behind me, even though I hadn't seen a single person in 2 days. When I finally hit the sealed road, I didn't stop. I drove all the way to Bairnsdale and parked at a 24-hour servo. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, just staring at the steering wheel, trying to make sense of it. It didn't make sense. That was the problem. There was no logical reason for that head to be there. I thought about wild dogs, but the cut was clean. Thought about maybe someone was hunting and messing with me, but why go through that effort? There were no other signs of people, no rubbish, no tire tracks, nothing. I didn't go to the police. I wouldn't even know what to say. I hadn't seen anyone. Nothing had been stolen or damaged. I was just scared. I went home, unpacked, and for the next few nights I didn't sleep much. I kept waking up, imagining that sound again, that soft plop outside the tent. Weeks went by, then months. I didn't go camping again that year. I told a couple of mates about it, made it into a weird story we laughed about at the pub, but deep down it never stopped bothering me. I still don't know who or what did that. Maybe someone had been watching me, maybe they lived nearby and didn't like people camping on that land. Maybe they were just twisted. All I know is it felt deliberate. It wasn't an accident or some animal thing. It was placed there and it was meant to be seen. I've camped since then, but never alone. Never that deep in the bush. Now I always stay in designated sites, where there's usually at least one other group nearby. And I always keep my Uda close. That one night changed how I see the bush. It's still beautiful, still peaceful, but I'm not blind to what could be out there anymore. Not ghosts or monsters, just people. And people are scarier than anything else when you're alone in the dark. Back in 2009, I was stationed at Fort Ewell, a remote army base deep in the northeastern woods of Pennsylvania. I was 23 then, part of a recon unit that spent most of its time in the field. The place was surrounded by endless forests, dense, quiet, and easy to get lost in. The kind of wilderness where you'd go 2 or 3 days without hearing anything man-made. No cars, no planes, no people. Just wind through trees and whatever lived out there. We did a lot of training exercises, and I'd end up sleeping outside more often than not. We weren't doing standard tent camping either. This was just rucksacks, sleeping bags, and the cold dirt. Maybe a poncho for overhead cover if it rained. When it was cold, which it often was in those months, we layered up, cinched our sleeping bags around our faces, and hoped nothing crawled into our boots overnight. It didn't take long for me to realize something was messing with my gear at night. The first time it happened, I chalked it up to poor packing. I woke up one morning and my small flashlight was missing. Thought I must have dropped it or set it down the night before. A few nights later, my protein bars were gone. I had stashed them in the top pouch of my ruck, zipped up tight, but they were just gone. I blamed a fox or a raccoon at first. That was until I woke up one night to the distinct sound of a zipper being opened. Slow, careful, like someone trying not to wake me. I froze in my bag. My rifle was beside me, within reach, but I didn't move. The sound stopped. I waited. Then I heard soft feet on the leaves, moving fast. When I finally got the nerve to sit up and flick on my headlamp, I saw the pouch on my vest wide open, a protein bar wrapper half chewed next to it. From that point on, it kept happening. Flashlights, granola bars, socks, even a damn compass once. I thought someone was screwing with me at first, maybe one of the guys playing jokes, but then I caught them in the act. We were in a training area called Echo Ridge. No permanent structures, just some fire-scarred clearings and a few makeshift shelters built by units that came before us. It was just after midnight, and I'd woken up needing to take a leak. I slid out of my bag, moved off a few feet to do my business, and turned back just in time to see a raccoon rifling through the outer pouch of my body armor. Thing had its little hands in there like it owned the place, tossing aside stuff it didn't want. I shouted, and it darted off into the brush. But what froze me wasn't the raccoon. It was what I saw next. Sitting a few feet away, right near the edge of the clearing, was another raccoon. Bigger. Massive, actually. It didn't run when I shouted. It didn't flinch. It just sat there, watching. I swear to this day it looked like it was waiting, like it was in charge. Over the next few weeks, I started paying more attention. I set small traps, nothing to hurt them, just things to alert me if they came close. Tied paracord to cans, laid lines of glow sticks, and even put down a cheap trail cam I bought off-post. That camera only lasted 2 nights before it was taken. Not knocked over, taken. Strap undone, camera missing. Found the strap 20 feet away. Never found the camera. It was like they knew what I was doing. Like they were learning. I'd wake up and find my stuff not just taken but organized differently. My kit would be opened, contents inspected. Only certain things were missing. It was always the food first, then small items like lighters, compasses, even a multi-tool I'd had since basic. They never took trash or useless junk. And it wasn't random. Felt intentional. The big one, the one I started calling Chief in my head, was always there. I'd wake up sometimes and see him sitting just outside the glow of the fire, still as a stump, eyes reflecting the light. I threw rocks at him once. He didn't move, just sat there. Eventually, the other guys started noticing too. I never talked about it, never said anything out loud, but I'd see them checking their kits in the mornings, whispering to each other. One guy lost his watch. Another found his MRE half-eaten, the plastic torn with careful precision. Someone else said their pouch had been unzipped while they were sleeping. This went on for the better part of 2 months. Every night out in those woods was another game of keep away with this pack of raccoons. And it wasn't like they were afraid. They were coordinated, methodical. I'm not saying they were intelligent like people, but they were damn close. Close enough that I started locking everything up with zip ties. I looped cord through my zippers, stashed stuff in dry bags, even tried sleeping with my gear inside my bag with me. Nothing worked. They always found a way. I started getting less sleep. Kept waking up, checking my stuff, jumping at every noise. Started messing with my head. One night, I thought I saw one of them standing on 2 legs near a tree, like it was keeping watch. I know how stupid that sounds. I hadn't slept well in weeks, but it stuck with me. That image burned into my head. Then one night, it all stopped. We were pulling an extended patrol loop through Sector 5. Out near an old fire trail the maps didn't even label properly. Cold, wet terrain. Moss-covered rocks, thick underbrush, and barely any flat ground. We hunkered down just before nightfall, built a small fire in a dugout pit, and got ready for another miserable night. That night, nothing came. No sounds. No rustling. No movement. My gear was untouched. The guy's stuff was untouched. It was quiet. Too quiet. When we moved on the next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd crossed some invisible border, like we'd wandered outside their territory. I never saw Chief again after that. No more stolen food. No more missing items. Whatever game they'd been playing, it was over. A month later, I rotated out and headed down south for more training. Warmer climate, different terrain, less raccoon-friendly. I never had another issue like that again. But to this day, whenever I go camping, I zip everything tight. I don't leave a single pouch open. I don't keep food in my tent. And I always keep one eye on the tree line, because I swear, absolutely swear, that group of raccoons was organized, that they were led by something smarter than the average pest. Not supernatural, not magical, just smart. Smarter than any of us wanted to believe. And the worst part is they weren't afraid. Not of us, not of guns, not of shouting or light or traps. They had a mission every night and they did it. It's been years now, but I still think about those woods, about the cold ground under my back, the sound of tiny fingers on nylon, the way my kit would be half open when I woke up, and that massive raccoon sitting in the dark like a damn commander. Whatever they were after, they didn't need all the food. They were collecting things, testing us, watching, and the scariest part of all, they were winning. It was late October 2018. A group of 3 of us had planned a backwoods camping trip down in southern Alabama, near the Talladega National Forest. It wasn't our first time doing this kind of trip. We liked to find quiet trailheads with a few miles of hiking, just far enough to get away from everything without needing a full day to reach the campsite. That time we settled on a remote trail that dropped about 4 miles deep into the woods. No service, no real foot traffic, and no nearby towns. Just thick trees, dry leaves, and silence. We had driven in early that morning from Birmingham. I was 29 at the time. My buddies, Connor and James, were both around the same age. We weren't hardcore survivalists or anything, but we had enough trips under our belts to know what we were doing. We kept our packs tight, only brought what we needed, and always prepared for a sudden change in weather. That weekend, though, was supposed to be perfect. The forecast said mid-50s during the day and mid-30s at night. Pretty standard fall weather down there. The hike in was smooth. We made good time and reached the spot we had scouted on satellite maps. A small clearing just off a bend in the trail, far enough away to be hidden, but still close enough that we could easily find our way back. The trees were mostly pines, but a few hardwoods had dropped a thick layer of dry leaves all over the ground. It smelled like fall, that musky, earthy scent that hits you when the woods start to shut down for winter. We set up camp like we usually did. Connor handled the tarp shelter and fire pit. James took care of the food and cooking gear, and I gathered firewood and set up a small windbreak using some dead branches and leaves. We had a solid meal of rice and beans cooked over the fire with some smoked sausage we brought in a vacuum-sealed bag. It was simple, hot, and filling. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped faster than any of us expected. By the time it was fully dark, it had already fallen into the upper 20s. That might not sound brutal to someone from the north, but in the deep south, that's uncommon, especially that early in the season. We had cold weather gear, but we hadn't really prepped for a hard freeze. Luckily, the fire was strong. We had collected plenty of wood, and the warmth from the flames mixed with full stomachs hit us hard. We sat around the fire for maybe an hour after eating, not saying much. Just the sounds of the wind pushing through the tall trees, the occasional pop from the fire, and the crunch of leaves from some distant movement. Probably just squirrels or raccoons. Eventually, we all laid down in our sleeping bags under the tarp. The cold was biting at the edges, but the fire's heat reached us just enough to keep things comfortable. I dozed off faster than I thought I would. I don't know how long I was out before I woke up. It was sometime in the early hours, probably around 2 or 3 in the morning. The tarp made it hard to see the sky, but I could feel the cold was worse than before. My nose burned from the freezing air. At first, I didn't know why I had woken up. Then I felt something tap the bottom of my sleeping bag. I looked up, still groggy, and saw James standing near my feet. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me and then nodded toward the fire. I turned my head and looked. There were 2 wild boars standing near the fire pit. Not just sniffing around the woods. These things were right in our camp, kicking up dirt and pacing near the embers like they owned the place. The fire had burned low, just a few orange coals glowing dimly in the ash. It cast just enough light to make out the shape of the animals. They were big, real big, maybe 160 or 170 pounds each, thick with muscle, low to the ground, and tense like coiled springs. One had tusks that curled up a little past its jawline. The other was darker, with patches of dried mud and something else smeared across its back. It was hard to tell in the dark. We didn't move. None of us had a real weapon. We brought a hand axe for splitting wood and a utility knife or two, but they were packed away near the fire pit, right where the boars were standing. All we could do was stay still. For the next hour or so, we laid there in total silence. Every so often, the boars would snort or make these deep, low grunts. They weren't interested in us directly, at least not at first. They just seemed curious about the smell of the camp, the leftover bits of food, the ashes, maybe even the warmth from the fire. At one point, one of them nudged a metal cup we had left by the fire pit. The clink it made felt like an explosion in the stillness. My heart didn't slow down the entire time. Boars aren't like deer. They're unpredictable, aggressive. If they decide something is a threat or competition for food, they don't back off. They charge. And a 150-pound boar with tusks and bad temper can kill you before you even get a chance to scream. We knew the odds. One wrong move, one rustle of a sleeping bag, and it could all go south. The worst part was the cold. Lying there, trying not to move, while the temperature kept dropping. I could feel the ice forming at the tips of my sleeping bag where moisture had settled. Every breath I took made my face colder, but I couldn't move, couldn't even twitch. My eyes stayed locked on the shapes in the dim light. Eventually, the fire faded into darkness. Nothing but cold coals and the faintest red shimmer in the ash. Once the light was completely gone, the boars snorted a few more times, kicked at the dirt, then slowly walked off into the trees. I heard leaves crunch under their hooves as they disappeared back into the forest. We didn't say anything, just waited. Probably another hour passed before I finally sat up. My joints ached from staying still so long. My fingers were stiff. My face felt numb. But we were okay. Alive. The boars hadn't noticed us, or if they had, they didn't care. We didn't go back to sleep after that. Just sat by the cold fire pit until the sky started to lighten. Then we got the fire going again and made some instant coffee with what was left of the water we brought. Nobody said a word. We didn't need to. We all knew how close we had come to a real bad night. Once the sun was up and the cold started to let go of the woods, we packed up camp. We didn't waste time. No slow breakfast, no sitting around. Just loaded up, double-checked our trash and gear, and got back on the trail. That hike out felt longer than 4 miles. Every little sound in the woods made my nerves jump. Every crack of a twig made me glance over my shoulder. We made it back to the truck by late morning. Loaded up, slammed the doors shut, and didn't speak until we hit the main road. I haven't camped that deep in the woods since. We still go on hikes, still set up camp now and then, but I stay closer to the trailhead now, and I keep that hand axe within reach. Always. It wasn't a ghost or a monster, just 2 animals doing what they do. But sometimes that's all it takes. Something real, something that doesn't care whether you're there or not. That night reminded me how small we really are out there, how fragile everything feels when it's just you, the trees, and the dark, and how lucky we were to leave without a scratch. It was the summer of 2013 when I went camping at a place called Cypress Hollow Camp, just outside a small town in northern Florida. I was 26 at the time and had decided to take a short trip with a couple of buddies. We all worked different jobs and barely saw each other anymore. So this was our chance to unwind, cook some food by the fire, drink some beer, and maybe float the river the next day. The campground had good reviews and was known for its clear water and tree-lined banks. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was peaceful and quiet and had enough space between sites that you didn't feel like you were sleeping next to strangers. We showed up late on a Friday afternoon. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that stuck to your skin like a wet shirt. The campground was maybe 3/4 full, a decent mix of families, college kids, and older couples who were clearly regulars. We picked a spot a little deeper in the woods, away from the main path and close to the river. There were towering oak trees all around us, with moss hanging off the branches. The sound of insects and frogs started up as the sun dropped behind the treetops. We spent the first evening grilling burgers, sitting in fold-out chairs, and watching the fire flicker. Nothing strange happened. In fact, everything was just the way a good camping trip should be. It wasn't until the second night that something changed. The next day, we floated the river for a couple of hours, drank too much, and got sunburned. We came back to camp before dark, cooked up some canned chili, and sat around the fire again. At some point, I decided to call it a night. I was a little drunk and worn out from the sun. My tent was a small one-person dome style, and I'd set it up under a big oak a few feet from the fire pit. I climbed in, zipped up, and laid on top of my sleeping bag. It must have been around 11:30 p.m. or so. Everything was quiet except for the usual night sounds. Crickets, frogs, a distant owl. I could faintly hear music coming from another site somewhere down the trail, but nothing out of the ordinary. I must have been asleep for maybe an hour when I heard something that made me snap upright in my tent. It was a deep, loud cracking sound, followed by a crash that shook the ground beneath me. It was the kind of noise you don't just hear, you feel it in your chest. For a moment, I thought someone was dragging something massive across the ground, like a dumpster. But then I realized what it really was. A tree had just fallen, a big one. My first thought wasn't panic. Honestly, I just laid back down. I told myself trees fall sometimes. Maybe it had rotted out at the base or gotten hit by lightning recently. I didn't think much of it. But about 10 minutes later, I started hearing voices. A lot of voices. And they weren't laughing or talking casually. They sounded serious, concerned. Then I saw flashlights flickering through the walls of my tent. That's when I unzipped the flap and stepped out. The air was still and warm, but there was a tension to it now. I walked toward the sounds, past the picnic table and the dying fire, toward where the lights were gathering. There were at least a dozen people up the path, all clustered around one area. When I got closer, I saw it. The tree had fallen across one of the campsites. Not just into it, right on it. It was a massive oak, maybe 4 feet in diameter at the base. Its trunk had landed directly on top of a tent that had been set up not far from the path. The tree had split in half near the base, probably from rot, and came down with such force that the ground was torn up where it hit. The tent was crushed completely. It didn't even look like a tent anymore, just a twisted pile of nylon and metal poles flattened against the dirt. There were people standing around, not saying much. A few had phones out. Someone had clearly already called emergency services, because not long after I got there, I heard sirens in the distance. A ranger truck showed up, followed by an ambulance. The paramedics walked straight to the wreckage and crouched down. It didn't take long to realize that whoever had been in that tent didn't survive. I heard someone say it was a couple in their late 30s. They had set up earlier in the day, just a little ways off the main loop. I remembered seeing them, actually. They had a dog with them. I didn't see the dog anywhere now. The paramedics and rangers didn't waste time. They started marking off the area with caution tape, and everyone was told to step back. Some people went back to their campsites. Others just stood around, watching in silence. I ended up sitting on a log near the path, not saying a word. It felt surreal, like I was in a scene from a movie or some documentary about freak accidents in nature. About an hour later, I saw the helicopter. The sound of its blades broke through the night like thunder. It hovered above the clearing for a minute before slowly lowering itself into a field near the ranger station, which wasn't too far away. I didn't walk over to see it land, but I knew they were airlifting the bodies out. They brought stretchers, loaded them up carefully, and carried them through the woods while spotlights lit up the area. It was done quietly, respectfully. That night, I didn't sleep. None of us did. We sat by the fire until sunrise, just kind of staring into the flames, not saying much. When morning came, we packed everything up without discussing it. We didn't even eat breakfast, just took down the tents, stuffed them in the cars, and drove out. I think about that trip every now and then. It wasn't the kind of thing you forget. The randomness of it all haunted me for a while. One minute you're lying in a tent, and the next minute something entirely out of your control ends everything. It's not the kind of fear that comes with scary movies or ghost stories. It's the kind that comes from knowing how fragile we really are, especially out there in the woods, where nature doesn't care who you are or what you're doing. I still go camping, though not as often. And when I do, I look up a lot more before I set up my tent. I check the trees. I check the ground. I don't pitch near dead limbs or hollow trunks. I pay attention in ways I never used to. That trip to Cypress Hollow wasn't supposed to be anything memorable. Just a weekend of drinking and floating the river. But it became something else. Something heavy. Something real. Something that reminded me, and maybe others who were there, that life doesn't give you warnings. Sometimes it just ends. And no matter how many times I replay that sound in my head, that deep cracking, that thunderous crash, I know there's nothing I or anyone else could have done. It was just one of those moments where everything changes without any reason, without any fairness, and without any time to react. I was 34 years old the winter I took a freelance guiding job in South Africa's northern bushveld. The region was dry, harsh, and mostly quiet during the off-season, but I liked it that way. Fewer tourists meant fewer distractions. I was there mostly for the peace. Just me, the wild, and the cold. I had worked safaris in Kruger and further north over the years, but that season I was camped in a more remote area on the edge of a private reserve near the border of Botswana. The name of the place was Matseek, but people rarely referred to it by name. It was a collection of dusty plains, low scrub, thorn trees, and dry riverbeds. The terrain wasn't forgiving, especially in the winter months when temperatures dropped below freezing at night. There were only 2 of us out there, me and another guide named Sam. He was older than me by about 10 years, quieter, and a bit more methodical. We were stationed at a temporary tented camp for about 2 weeks. No clients, just us doing wildlife tracking and route mapping for a lodge planning to open in the spring. That kind of work meant long days out walking, setting camera traps, making notes about game paths, water holes, and dangerous spots. At night, we returned to a pair of canvas tents set up in a small clearing, maybe 40 yards from a dry riverbed. We didn't bother with too much equipment, just enough food, 2 rifles, a handheld radio, and some gear to make fire and basic meals. The camp was unassuming. The tents were old army surplus jobs, with canvas thick enough to block out the wind but still light enough to feel every shift in breeze. We had no fences around the site, and apart from a few solar-powered lights, we relied on the bush and our wits to stay safe. That week had been especially cold. During the days it reached about 15 or 16 degrees Celsius, but once the sun dipped behind the thorn trees, the temperature plunged quickly. Nights often dropped to 1 or 2 degrees, and a couple of times it had flirted with 0. I slept in long thermal underwear, with my sleeping bag zipped tight around me, and a beanie pulled low over my ears. Even then, it was hard to stay warm. One night, I went to sleep early. The day had been long. We tracked a herd of buffalo across rocky terrain, and my legs ached from it. I barely managed to finish a can of beans over the fire before crawling into my tent. Sam was still out checking the perimeter and probably having a smoke. We kept to ourselves mostly. We weren't there to socialize. I remember falling asleep quickly, muscles sore and mind blank. The cold made it easy to drift off, buried deep inside the sleeping bag. The sounds of the bush at night had long become a kind of lullaby for me. Distant jackal calls, the rustle of leaves, the occasional owl. But I woke up suddenly, sometime in the early hours before dawn. It was still completely dark, and there were no bird calls yet, only silence. What stirred me wasn't noise, but a feeling. Something heavy and warm was pressed against my back. My first groggy thought was that I'd rolled against my backpack or maybe a pile of clothes I'd forgotten to stash. Except it wasn't that. It was soft, not like fabric. There was a texture to it. Hair, heat, something very much alive. Something breathing. I lay still. That's all I could do. I was pressed up against the rear canvas wall of the tent, and whatever was behind it was right there, resting against me through the fabric. It wasn't moving much, but its body rose and fell with slow, steady breaths. That's when the cold in the air felt sharper, like my blood turned to ice. My breath stopped. I didn't know what it was at first, not exactly, but I knew it was big, very big. Big enough to give off body heat through thick canvas in freezing air. My heartbeat was in my ears, thudding fast. I barely dared to move. I wanted to believe it was something harmless. Maybe a bush pig, maybe even a stray dog from a nearby farm. But my gut already knew. I stayed like that, frozen and listening. The animal outside made no sound. No snarl, no breath beyond its slow rhythm. It wasn't pawing or sniffing. It was just lying there. Then I heard something else. A low whisper from outside, coming from Sam's tent. His tent was about 10 meters away, barely within earshot if you whispered just right. He must have sensed something too. His voice trembled, and he spoke quietly. So quietly I almost missed it. He said my name. I didn't answer right away. I was too scared to even blink. But after a few seconds, I answered. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I thought it was the right thing. Maybe I wanted to know if he had seen something. Maybe I was just tired and confused. I answered in a full voice. I said yes. The moment the word left my lips, the weight against the tent shifted. Fast. The body pressed against me jerked upright. I heard the shuffle of massive paws on dry leaves. The deep grunt of an animal surprised, alert. I didn't see it. I didn't have to. I knew. It was a lion. A big male by the weight, by the power in the sound it made as it ran. I heard it crash through the underbrush, galloping away from the tent with heavy strides. There was no roar, just the sound of its escape. I sat up fast, heart hammering, every hair on my body on end. I unzipped the tent and stumbled out into the cold. My boots weren't even fully on. Sam was outside his tent, holding a flashlight in one hand and his rifle in the other. His eyes met mine. He didn't have to say anything. We checked the area as best we could without making too much noise. There were clear paw prints in the dust right behind my tent. Massive, round tracks deep in the earth. Sam found a few strands of hair caught on a bush just outside camp. Short, tan-colored fur. We stayed up the rest of the night by the fire, rifles close. Neither of us said much. We didn't need to. We both knew how close it had been. The cold didn't matter anymore. My body was still shaking, but it wasn't from the temperature. By the next afternoon, we had packed the camp and left. There was no point staying. That lion had come too close, and it wasn't the kind of thing you risk again. If it had stayed just a few minutes longer, if I turned in my sleep and startled it, there was no fence, no guard, just thin canvas between me and one of the most powerful predators on Earth. Back in town, we filed a report with the lodge company, then went our separate ways. I took a few days to rest in a small hostel before heading out on my next job. Sam returned to a camp further north. People often think being out in the wild is about bravery, that it's about facing danger head-on. But sometimes it's just about luck, about being quiet at the right time, about breathing slow, about not dying because something warm and alive decided to lie down beside you for the night and not kill you in your sleep. It changed the way I slept outdoors after that. I still guide, still camp, still track lions sometimes, but I never forget that night. I never forget the feel of that body through the tent, the heat of it, the breath, the weight, and I never speak too loud in the dark. It was the summer of 2009, and I was 15 years old. My family had this yearly tradition where we'd spend a week camping at Walnut Ridge State Park, a quiet place tucked away in the wooded hills of southern Missouri. We'd been going there for years. It had a decent lake for fishing, a couple of trails, and just enough people to feel safe but still feel like we were getting away from everything. My parents always picked the same loop in the campground, Loop C, the one closest to the edge of the forest. That year, it was just like always. My parents set up the big family tent, my younger sister had her little setup close to us, and my older brother was staying home that year to work his summer job. I was happy about that. Meant I got more freedom and space. My best friend Jacob came along like he had the past 2 years. He was the kind of kid who liked anything that felt like a tradition, and we had one of our own. Every night after the fire burned down and the campsite got quiet, we'd go walking in the woods. We called it the ritual. It wasn't anything dramatic. We just liked walking through the trails with our flashlights off, trying to rely on moonlight and memory. We'd stick close to the campgrounds the first couple of nights, but as the week went on and we got more confident, we'd push further. That night, Thursday night, I think, we decided to take it further than we ever had. We left around 11:30, after the fire was out and our parents were asleep. We brought our flashlights, but, as usual, kept them off. The woods at Walnut Ridge weren't dense, but they weren't exactly clear either. The moon helped, shining enough to see the outlines of the trees, but we still had to move slow. The gravel path disappeared the deeper you went, replaced by old forest floor and deer trails. I liked that. It felt like exploring, like we were somewhere far from people even though we were probably still within a mile of the campground. The night was cool, just enough breeze to rustle leaves overhead. Bugs chirped all around us. We joked sometimes that the louder the bugs were, the safer you were. If the woods got quiet, something was wrong. That was something we told ourselves to sound like we knew what we were doing. In truth, we didn't. We were just two bored teenagers pretending to be brave. We probably walked half a mile or so into the woods, maybe a little more. It was hard to tell, but it felt further than we had ever gone. We weren't on a trail anymore. I remember Jacob tripped over a thick root and barely caught himself. We laughed about it for a second, but then we both heard it. A soft, whispering sound behind us. It was faint, but there was no mistaking it. It didn't sound like wind. It was too controlled, too intentional. It was like someone muttering, just loud enough for us to hear it but not make out words. We both stopped walking. We hit our flashlights and spun around fast. The beams cut through the trees and lit up patches of brush and trunks, but nothing was there. Just forest. We stayed frozen for a moment, scanning everything we could with the lights. Nothing. After a minute or two, we told ourselves it was probably an animal or maybe the wind tricking us. We kept walking, but we turned our flashlights on for good. We stayed quiet, a little more alert, and then we heard it again. Same whispering, same direction, still behind us. We stopped again, lights pointing everywhere. I started to feel that weird crawling sensation on my skin, like goosebumps without the cold. This time we stood still longer. We whispered to each other about heading back, but neither of us wanted to sound scared. Still, something didn't feel right. The air felt heavier, and the bugs weren't chirping as loud anymore. We finally agreed, let's just head back. We turned around and started walking fast, not running, but close to it. Our lights were flicking through the woods, checking every shadow. I kept looking behind us every couple of seconds, and then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a fallen log or a lump of dirt, but then it moved. It was a woman. She was crawling on the ground, low and slow, like she was dragging herself. Her clothes were dark and loose, maybe black pants and a jacket. Her hair looked long and messy. Her skin was pale, and she was completely covered in dirt. Face, hands, everything. She was whispering random words, just strings of them that didn't make sense. We both froze. I remember my light shaking in my hand. She didn't seem to notice us at first, just kept crawling and whispering. But when we moved the beams right onto her face, she stopped. She slowly stood up, wobbling a little. That's when I realized she wasn't hurt. She was drunk, or high, or maybe both. She mumbled something loud enough for us to hear. She was looking for her campsite. I didn't know what to do. Neither did Jacob. We just stood there, waiting for something to happen. Then she started walking toward us. Not fast, not threatening, just stumbling. She looked disoriented and confused. Her eyes were glassy. We kept the lights on her as she got closer. She wasn't young, maybe in her late 30s or 40s. Her face looked hollow, and she had leaves stuck in her clothes and hair. She smelled bad, like booze and dirt. She kept repeating that she needed to find her campsite. We figured she must have wandered off drunk and got turned around. But we were deep in the woods, half a mile or more from the nearest campsite. There was no way she wandered that far just looking for a bathroom. We didn't really talk about it. We just turned around and started walking back toward camp, slower this time so she could follow. She stumbled behind us, still whispering now and then, but not as loud. I kept glancing over at Jacob. He looked just as freaked out as I felt. I kept thinking, what if we hadn't walked out that far? Would anyone have found her? The whole walk back felt like it took an hour, but it was probably 15 minutes. When we got close enough to see the glow of campfires and lanterns, she suddenly got a little more alert. She walked faster. When we got back to Loop C, she stopped near the bathroom building and pointed at a group of tents on the far side. We followed her that way, and sure enough, there was a group of maybe 5 or 6 people around a fire. They looked surprised to see us. One of the women jumped up and grabbed the lady by the arm, like she hadn't even realized she was gone. We stood there for a second, trying to figure out if we should say anything. No one asked us questions. They just acted like it wasn't a big deal. That felt weird, like they were too relaxed about it. Jacob and I walked back to our tent without saying a word. We both crawled into our sleeping bags and laid there for a long time, just listening to the night. The bugs were back, chirping away. Everything seemed normal again, but it stuck with me, still does. If we hadn't walked that far into the woods that night, if we had stuck to our usual trail or called it early, she would have been out there alone, crawling around in the dark, whispering to herself, maybe all night, maybe longer. She wasn't a ghost. She wasn't possessed. She was just a woman, messed up and lost in the woods. But that made it feel worse in a way, because it was real. It wasn't a campfire story. It happened, and it made me realize how easy it is for something small to turn into something big. All it takes is one person wandering too far in the wrong state of mind. After that night, Jacob and I didn't do the ritual again. Not that trip. Not ever. We still camped sometimes, and we stayed friends for a while after, but we never walked into the woods at night again. Not without lights. Not without a plan. Because now we knew what could be out there. Not monsters. Not myths. Just people. And sometimes that's scarier.